She's using you. Don't marry her, the little girl shouted as she ran straight down the aisle, her small shoes striking the stone path in quick, urgent beats. Please don't marry that lady, sir. She's only using you for your money, and then she'll leave you. For one lone, stunned moment, the entire Ashford estate went silent. At the altar, William Ashford stood with the wedding ring between his fingers. Beside William, Vanessa Hale slowly lowered her bouquet. She turned toward him with sharpened disbelief in her eyes. Who is this child, William? Why is she standing here talking like this? William did not move. In the front row, William's older cousin, Eleanor Ashford, rose halfway from her seat with the composed authority of a woman who had spent her life keeping family embarrassment from becoming public scandal. Everyone, please remain calm, she said smoothly, lifting one hand. The ceremony is still proceeding. This is only a small oversight. Another relative quickly added, please stay seated. There is no reason for concern. We'll have this sorted in a moment. A few guests nodded, eager for normality to be restored. Several shifted back into their chairs, as if discipline alone could erase what had just happened. William looked at Annie, then at the ring in his hand, then back at Annie again. Do you understand what you're doing? He asked, his voice low, firm, and unmistakably stern. This is my wedding. It is not the place for you to run in here and accuse people of things you know nothing about. Annie lifted her chin. I do know, she said. Please don't marry her. She's only using you. She wants your money, and then she'll leave you. A murmur swept the guests. William's jaw tightened. Don't speak about my bride that way. What could you possibly know about her? His voice sharpened. She has always been kind. She has always been gracious. You do not get to stand here and talk about her like that. Vanessa seized the moment. Her face a mix of wounded pride and outrage. Why would that girl do this? She snapped. Why is she trying to ruin the ceremony? She turned sharply toward William, narrowing her eyes. I have never seen that child in my life. Who is she? Why does she keep interfering with our wedding? Then, with a sudden edge that made several guests glance up in surprise, she asked, Is she your daughter? Is that what this is? Have you been hiding something from me, William? Is this child yours? A shocked stillness spread across the lawn. William turned to stare at her. What? You heard me, Vanessa said. She appears out of nowhere in the middle of our vows, and you're not nearly as startled as you should be. I want to know who she is. At that moment, Marissa hurried forward from the edge of the garden, pale with horror, but still holding herself with dignity. She reached Annie and laid a steady hand on the child's shoulder. Mr. Ashford, she said, breathless but composed. I am so sorry. William looked from the mother to the child and immediately understood. Annie is your daughter. Yes, sir. Vanessa turned toward Marissa with visible irritation. Then perhaps you'd like to explain why your child has chosen to ruin my wedding. Before Marissa could answer, Annie spoke again. Because you're lying. The words landed harder than shouting. The officiant, a polished minister with silver hair and years of public grace, stepped slightly closer and cleared his throat. Mr. Ashford, he said carefully. If you place the ring on the bride's finger now, we can finish the ceremony on time and address this unfortunate disruption afterward. William did not even glance at him. He looked at Annie instead. What do you mean, she's lying? She did the same thing to my daddy. She made him leave my mama. She wanted his money, too. He kept giving her things, and then he stopped being with us. And when he got sick, she left him. Vanessa answered at once. This is absurd, William. She is a child. She doesn't know what she's saying. Yes, I do, Annie said. William looked down at the ring. The diamond flashed hard and cold in the lowering sunlight. Then he looked back at Annie and asked, Did your mother tell you to come out here and say this? No, sir. Then why did you? Annie answered without hesitation. Because I didn't want you to end up like my daddy. William held her gaze for one beat longer. Then, in a quieter voice that somehow made the whole garden lean in, he asked, "Do you have any proof?" The question seemed too large for a child, but Annie did not back away from it. "Yes, sir," she said. Marissa looked down at her daughter in surprise. Annie reached into the small white purse hanging across her body, a child's purse, the sort brought to weddings because little girls like to feel dressed up, and pulled out a folded photograph, worn soft at the corners from being handled too many times. Her small hand trembled only once before she steadied it and walked the last few steps forward. William took the photograph from her. It showed a man standing beside Vanessa near what looked like the entrance to a modest apartment building. The image was not professionally taken. It had the accidental intimacy of a picture snapped from a distance by someone who had not wanted to be seen. The man was smiling in a way William had never seen before on a stranger's face. Foolish. Hopeful. Open. Vanessa was younger in the picture, but unmistakably herself. Annie's voice came small and clear through the silence. "That's my daddy," she said. His name was Daniel Brooks. Vanessa made a sharp sound before she could stop herself. It was barely more than a gasp, but it tore through the stillness. Her head snapped toward Annie. "What?" William looked up from the photograph at once. For the first time since the interruption began, Vanessa no longer looked offended. She looked startled. William's eyes narrowed. "You know that name," he said. Vanessa recovered too quickly. "No, of course I don't." "You reacted," William said, cutting across her. His tone had changed now. The warmth of a groom was gone from it completely. "Why did you react?" "I reacted because this is insane," Vanessa replied. "Because some child is waving around a random picture and saying outrageous things in the middle of my wedding." William took one slow step toward her, the photograph still in his hand. "Then tell me why you looked like you'd seen a ghost when she said his name." Vanessa's mouth tightened. "William, please. You are not seriously entertaining this. Answer me. It means nothing. Did you know Daniel Brooks?" "No." "Look at the picture." "I don't need to." "Why not?" "Because I have never seen it before." William's stare hardened, and what he saw made something cold settle in his chest. Annie spoke again, not louder, but with the unbearable certainty of someone too young to be this serious. "My mama kept that picture because she knew one day nobody would believe us." Vanessa turned toward her with anger beginning to crack through the polish. "You don't know anything about me." "I know what you do," Annie said. The officiant tried one last time. "Mr. Ashford, if we delay further, the ceremony." "The ceremony is over," William said. No one moved. Vanessa stared at him. He closed his hand around the ring and turned fully toward her. "You said you had never seen this child before." "I haven't." "You said you didn't know her father." "I don't." "Then why did his name shake you?" She said nothing. William lifted the photograph slightly between them. "Who was Daniel Brooks to you?" Vanessa's silence lasted only 2 seconds, but it was enough. Enough for William to feel the ground shift beneath everything he had been standing on. He looked at Marissa. He looked at Annie. Then back at Vanessa. "I want the truth," he said. For a long moment after William Ashford said he wanted the truth, the garden remained suspended in a silence so complete it seemed to press against the skin. No one quite knew whether the wedding had ended or merely paused on the edge of collapse. But it was Vanessa who moved first. "No," she said, turning sharply toward William, her bouquet trembling just enough to betray that her calm was no longer effortless. "No, William, you cannot possibly mean that. We are not ending the ceremony because of a child's wild story." Her voice carried farther now, the softness she usually wore traded for urgency. She stepped closer to him, not close enough to seem desperate, but close enough to reclaim the space beside him, as if standing there alone might reassert her place. "This is our wedding," she said. "Everything is ready. Our families are here. Your guests are here. The officiant is here.
We are seconds away from being married. You cannot just stop because some little girl ran in and said something reckless." William did not answer immediately.
His gaze shifted from Vanessa to Annie, then to the photograph still resting in his hand.
Daniel Brooks.
The name had not meant anything to him 10 minutes earlier.
Now it seemed to have split the afternoon open. Vanessa followed the movement of his eyes and understood what troubled him.
She drew in a quick breath and tried again, more controlled this time, her tone almost pleading.
"William, listen to me, please. You know me. You know the kind of woman I am. You know how much I love you."
She gave a short, incredulous shake of her head and gestured toward Annie without looking at her directly.
"This little girl does not know me.
She does not know anything about my life, my past, or who I am to you."
Annie stood perfectly still. Vanessa turned slightly toward the guests, appealing to the room itself.
"Surely no one here believes this is reasonable," she said, forcing out a strained laugh. "A wedding should not be destroyed because a child decided to say something cruel." William's cousin, Eleanor, rose again from the front row, trying to seize whatever remained of the ceremony before it dissolved completely.
"William," she said in her low, dignified voice. "Perhaps Vanessa is right. This can still be handled privately. Everyone is already here. There's no sense letting a small disturbance ruin the day."
An older family friend nodded at once.
"Exactly. Let the ceremony continue. There's time to sort all this out afterward." The support seemed to revive Vanessa.
She turned back to William with new insistence.
"Do you hear that? This is a misunderstanding, nothing more.
If there are questions, we can answer them later, but do not humiliate me in front of everyone." The minister, sensing an opening, stepped forward with professional caution.
"Mr. Ashford," he said gently, "if I may, there is wisdom in keeping the day intact.
You may place the ring now, conclude the vows, and then have whatever private conversation you feel is necessary."
Vanessa seized the thought at once. "Yes, exactly. Thank you."
Then, to William more softly, "Please put the ring on my finger."
"Finish this. We can deal with the rest after the guests leave." But William did not move.
The stillness in him had changed.
It no longer looked like shock.
Vanessa saw it too, and fear flashed across her face before she forced it away.
"William," she said again, this time with a quiet intensity that only he and those nearest the altar could fully hear. "You are making a terrible mistake. You know how people talk. You know what this will become if you stop the ceremony now. There will be rumors before dinner is served. Your name will be tied to scandal before sunset. Please do not let this turn into a spectacle." At last he spoke. "You seem very concerned with what people will say." She stared at him. "Of course I am concerned. Any woman would be." "Any woman," he repeated.
"Or a woman with something to lose." The question struck her hard enough that she answered too quickly.
"That is unfair." "Is it?" Vanessa took another step toward him. "Yes, it is.
I have done nothing except stand here and be accused by a child I have never seen before." Annie's voice came clear through the hush.
"That's not true."
Vanessa turned her head sharply.
"Stop saying that." "It's still not true," Annie said. Vanessa's calm began to fade.
"William, I will not stand here and let a child interrogate me."
"No one asked you to," William said. "Then why are you treating her like she matters more than I do?"
The question hung there, too naked to be elegant. Several guests lowered their eyes. Others watched without blinking.
William looked at Vanessa for a long moment.
"Because she may be telling the truth." A ripple passed visibly through the seated crowd.
Vanessa's face went white. "That is unbelievable," she said. "After everything between us, after everything I have shared with you, after the life we were about to begin together, you would stand there and tell me you are willing to believe a child over me?" William's hand tightened around the ring and the folded photograph. "I'm willing to believe what I see." "What exactly do you think you see?"
I saw your face when Annie said Daniel Brooks.
Vanessa opened her mouth, then closed it.
William did not let the pause breathe. I saw you react before you could stop yourself.
That proves nothing. It proves you knew the name.
No, it proves I was startled.
Why? Because this entire situation is absurd.
Her voice rose now.
No longer musical. No longer measured.
She caught herself almost immediately and softened her tone. William, she said carefully.
Please think about what you are doing. Think about me. Think about us.
If you stop now, you are not protecting the truth.
You are rewarding disruption.
You are letting your own wedding be hijacked by someone who has no place here. At that, Annie finally looked at Vanessa instead of William.
I do have a place here, she said. My mama works here. Vanessa's expression turned cool.
That does not give you the right to run into my wedding and accuse me of things you cannot understand.
I understand enough. Do you? Vanessa asked. Do you understand what marriage is? What adults promise each other? What a life together means? Annie answered at once. It means you shouldn't lie.
The simplicity of it silenced even the guests. William saw the exact moment Vanessa realized she was losing the room. She turned away from Annie and tried one final time to pull him back toward the script she had built for the day. Her voice softened to the intimate tone she usually reserved for evenings in his study or slow dinners on the terrace. William, she said, almost whispering now.
Look at me. Not at her. Me. You know who I am. You know how I have cared for you. You know the life we planned. Don't throw that away because of a scene.
For a fraction of a second, he remembered exactly what she wanted him to remember. Her hand on his sleeve at charity dinners. The low laugh she used only with him. The way she had once stood in his kitchen late at night with a cup of tea and spoken about wanting a home, not just wealth. She had always known how to make comfort sound like devotion. Then he looked at Annie again. A little girl in a blue dress, standing in the middle of a garden full of powerful adults, refusing to back down, even though every instinct around her was trying to push her back into silence. And he thought of what it would cost a child like that to speak in a room like this. If this story is moving you, you're watching Storyverse, where every tale is told with truth and heart.
Subscribe now so you never miss a story like this.
No, he said.
Vanessa's face tightened.
No, we are not continuing.
He turned toward Eleanor and the rest of his family. The ceremony is over. Vanessa made a sound of disbelief.
William, stop this. But he was no longer looking at her. Eleanor, he said, his voice calm and decisive.
Please ask everyone to return to the house. Dinner will be served inside.
Charles will speak to the caterer. I want the garden cleared. Eleanor hesitated only a beat, then straightened and faced the guests with the poise of a woman who knew scandal was best managed through movement.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. Please proceed to the house. The staff will guide you.
Chairs shifted.
Programs folded. Conversation returned in low, shocked threads.
A senator's wife placed a hand at her throat as she stood. One of William's partners leaned toward another and murmured something too quietly to hear. The polished surface of the afternoon had cracked for good.
Vanessa stared at William as the first guests began to leave.
You cannot do this to me, she said under her breath. He finally turned back to her. What I cannot do, he said, is put this ring on your finger while I'm still wondering why a child knew the name of a dead man, and why you flinched when she said it. She held his gaze, and this time there was no softness left in hers at all. So that's it, she said.
You're choosing this. I'm choosing not to ignore it. That child is manipulating you.
William glanced at Annie, then at Marissa, who looked as though she wanted the ground to open beneath her feet, and yet would not drag her daughter backward now that the truth had begun to speak for itself.
She didn't look like she came here to manipulate anyone, he said. Vanessa's eyes narrowed. Then what did she come for? Annie answered before William could. To stop you.
Vanessa let out one cold breath through her nose, the nearest she had yet come to losing control entirely.
William watched her closely.
He no longer saw an offended bride fighting for dignity. He saw a woman fighting to keep hold of a moment that was slipping away from her.
That difference changed everything.
He slipped the ring into his pocket. "Charles," he said as his attorney approached the altar.
"Take Miss Hale to the library.
I'll speak with her there."
Vanessa stiffened at the title. Miss Hale.
For the first time that afternoon, she had no answer.
William looked at Marissa. Then Annie.
"And you," he said quietly.
"Come with me afterward. I want the full truth. All of it."
The garden continued to empty around them, white petals shifting in the breeze where vows had almost been spoken. But the wedding was over, and for the first time since Annie had run down the aisle, William Ashford was no longer standing there as a groom trying to preserve a ceremony. He was standing there as a man beginning to doubt the woman he had almost called his wife. By the time William stepped into the breakfast room, the house had already begun doing what houses like his were built to do: absorb shock behind polished doors and good manners. From somewhere deeper in the estate came the softened sounds of redirected celebration.
China touched china in the dining room.
Staff moved with trained discretion, carrying roasted chicken, buttered rolls, green beans with bacon, carved ham, and bowls of potato salad into spaces meant for laughter rather than whispered speculation. Guests who, an hour earlier, had expected to toast to marriage were now being seated at long candlelit tables and served supper as though a wedding interrupted at the altar were merely another inconvenience to be folded into the evening.
Wealth had always known how to disguise discomfort with service.
The breakfast room, tucked at the back of the house near the garden corridor, felt smaller and more honest than the public rooms. It was painted a pale cream with blue and white china in a glass cabinet, an afternoon light still lying warm across the table. Annie sat beside her mother with a plate in front of her. Mrs. Porter had done exactly as instructed. There were buttermilk biscuits, sliced chicken breast, green beans, a small bowl of strawberries, and a glass of sweet tea watered down with ice. Marissa sat upright in the chair beside her, her hands wrapped tightly around her own glass, though she had not touched it. Both looked up when William entered.
He closed the door behind him. For a moment, no one spoke.
The quiet was no longer the stunned silence of the garden.
It was heavier than that.
Quieter. Weighted with the knowledge that once a truth had been spoken aloud, it could no longer be placed back where it had been hidden.
William remained standing at the head of the table.
"I asked for the truth," he said, looking first at Marissa, then at Annie.
"Now I'm asking again. I want everything."
Marissa lowered her eyes briefly, not out of guilt, but out of habit, as though years of speaking carefully in other people's homes had taught her to measure every word before letting it out. When she looked up again, there was shame in her face.
"Yes. But also exhaustion."
The exhaustion of a woman who had spent too long carrying something heavy without ever setting it down.
"Mr. Ashford," she began. "I never wanted this to happen here. Not like this. I know." "No, sir."
She shook her head once.
"I don't think you do. I have worked in this house a long time. I know what today was supposed to mean. I know what your guests must think now. Annie should never have had to run into your wedding."
Annie sat still beside her, hands folded near her plate. She did not interrupt. She was watching William with a level, searching gaze that made it impossible to treat her like background to the story.
William pulled out a chair across from them and sat down.
"Then tell me why she did." Marissa drew in a breath and let it out slowly. "Because when she saw Miss Hale here for the first time, she recognized her before I did."
William said nothing.
Marissa looked over at Annie, then back at him.
"I hadn't seen that woman in years. Not up close, not in good light.
Not dressed in silk and pearls and speaking like she belonged in rooms like yours."
"But Annie."
She stopped, collecting herself.
"Children remember differently.
They remember what fear looked like in a room. They remember who changed the air in a house." That line stayed with him at once.
William thought of Annie in the garden.
Not afraid exactly, but urgent. As though she had recognized danger before anyone else had even noticed the weather changing. He placed the photograph on the table between them.
Start with Daniel Brooks. Marissa's fingers tightened around her glass. Daniel was my husband.
The sentence landed with a sorrow so old and worn it no longer needed drama to carry weight. We met young, she continued.
Nothing dramatic. Just church and family and work.
He wasn't a rich man, and he wasn't polished, but he was kind once.
Funny.
The sort of man who remembered if I liked onions cooked soft or crisp. The sort who'd stop at the gas station and come home with a candy bar for no reason. Her mouth shifted, not quite into a smile.
He loved music.
Old soul records, mostly on Saturdays. He'd have them playing while he fixed things around the apartment. Annie lowered her gaze to the untouched biscuit on her plate. William listened without interrupting.
For a long while, Marissa said, we were just ordinary people trying to stay afloat.
Rent, groceries, utility bills, school clothes, car trouble. All the things that wear out a family, but don't break it if there's enough love in the house.
She paused. Then he met her.
The room did not need Vanessa's name. William leaned back in his chair, one hand resting against the table edge.
Where? I'm not sure exactly where it began.
He said he met her through a friend, then through work, then by accident. The story changed every time. Marissa's voice stayed even, but the steadiness now felt earned rather than natural.
At first, it was little things. A new shirt he couldn't afford.
Long phone calls he took outside. Being late and acting like I was difficult for asking why.
Then money started disappearing.
Annie spoke for the first time since William had sat down. He used to bring home cash in his wallet, she said. Then he stopped.
Marissa gave a small nod.
He said overtime had been cut, but somehow he still had money for gas to drive across town. Still had money for dinners he never ate at home. Still had money for gifts I never saw but knew had been bought.
William glanced at Annie. You remember that?
Yes. It was a simple answer, and all the more powerful for not being dressed up.
Marissa looked tired suddenly, as if memory itself took effort.
I followed him once, she said. That's where the photograph came from. William's eyes dropped to the picture again. He was standing outside an apartment building with her, she said. Looking at her the way a fool looks at a miracle. I stayed across the street in the car and took the picture because by then I already knew, nobody believes a wife with no proof. Not if the other woman is pretty enough. Not if she knows how to talk.
William's jaw tightened.
He left not long after that, Marissa continued.
Not all at once.
Men like Daniel don't always walk out in one big scene.
Sometimes they drift away by inches. A missed supper, a late night, a lie, another lie.
Then one day you realize the man who used to laugh in your kitchen has started looking at home like it's the place he's trying to escape from. The breakfast room seemed quieter with every word. From somewhere down the hall came the muffled sound of guests being invited to dessert.
The contrast felt almost obscene. William asked, and Annie?
Marissa looked down at her daughter, then back at him. She saw more than I wanted her to.
Children always do. Annie's voice came calm and direct. My mama cried in the kitchen after he left. She thought I was asleep.
Marissa closed her eyes briefly.
Not in shame. In pain.
William looked at Annie again, and for the first time, the child's interruption in the garden began to take its full shape in his mind. This had not been childish mischief, nor a servant's daughter repeating household gossip. It had been a witness recognizing the beginning of an old wound in a new place.
What happened when he got sick? William asked. Marissa answered slowly. I didn't know at first. He wasn't living with us anymore.
He had sold his truck by then, borrowed money, burned through what he had. From what I later heard, she was still seeing him as long as he could give her something.
Her voice turned colder there, though never louder. When he couldn't anymore, she disappeared. Annie lifted her eyes. He called one time. Both adults turned to her. Marissa's face changed. Annie, it's all right.
Let her speak, William said quietly.
Annie nodded once. He called late. Mama was in the shower, so I answered. He sounded tired.
She paused, not struggling for drama, only for accuracy.
He asked if Mama was there. I said yes.
He got quiet for a second, and then asked if I was being good for her. Marissa pressed her lips together.
What else? William asked.
He said he'd come see me soon.
Annie looked at the table. He didn't. The sentence landed with more force than tears ever could have.
Marissa spoke again before the silence hardened too much. A few weeks later, someone from the hospital called.
Then another man called after that. Daniel was gone.
William let that sit between them.
And Vanessa? Marissa's answer came without hesitation. Gone before the body cooled.
The words were quiet, but they struck hard. William looked once more at the photograph, then at the mother and daughter sitting across from him in the soft yellow light of the breakfast room. Behind the walls of his house, guests were still being served on silver trays. His staff was still smoothing over scandal with coffee and pie. Yet here, at this table, sat the human cost of a woman he had nearly married. Marissa straightened a little in her chair.
I did not tell Annie to run into that garden. I would never have chosen that. But I understand why she did it. She looked at him directly now.
Because she saw what I saw too late.
And she did not want you learning it the way we did.
William held her gaze.
Do you have anything else? He asked. Letters, receipts, messages. Anything that ties Vanessa Hale to Daniel Brooks beyond this photograph? Marissa nodded slowly. I kept what I could. Bring me all of it.
She hesitated. Sir, if I do that, there is no taking it back. William reached into his pocket, felt the weight of the wedding ring still there, and understood that nothing about this day could be taken back.
Good, he said. Then we're past pretending.
William left the breakfast room with the photograph in one hand and the weight of the ring still pressing against his pocket like a private accusation. The corridor outside felt cooler than the room he had just stepped out of, though that may have had less to do with temperature than with the shift in atmosphere. The back hall was quiet, but not still. Staff moved through it with deliberate discretion, carrying dessert trays, folded table linens, fresh pitchers of iced tea, and the unspoken understanding that something had gone wrong in the front of the house, and it was now their job to help the evening survive it. Mrs. Porter passed him with a silver coffee service balanced carefully on a tray and lowered her eyes just enough to show respect without intruding on whatever was written across his face.
William appreciated that.
He had never had much use for sympathy from people who had not earned the right to give it. By the time he reached the library, his anger had cooled into something more useful. The library was one of the oldest rooms in the house. A long, dark-paneled space lined with built-in shelves and family portraits that watched everything with painted disapproval. The lamps had been turned on early. The last of the evening light pressed weakly at the tall windows, but the room itself had already surrendered to shadow and gold lamplight. It smelled faintly of leather, dust, and old paper. A fire had not been laid in the hearth because spring had come warm that year. Yet the room still carried the gravity of a place where decisions were meant to be made carefully, and rarely.
Vanessa stood near the mantel with her bouquet discarded on a side table.
She had removed her veil. It lay beside the flowers in a soft spill of tulle, like something shed rather than set down.
Her posture was impeccable. But William could see the cracks now. Tension at the jaw.
One shoulder held a fraction higher than the other.
The bride's softness was gone.
What remained was poise stripped down to strategy. Charles stood a few feet away, one hand resting lightly on a closed leather portfolio. He did not look tense. Men like Charles Reed had spent too many years handling scandals, indiscretions, divorces, inheritance wars, and quiet criminal exposures to be rattled by domestic drama in an expensive room. He simply inclined his head when William entered.
She asked for 5 minutes alone before you arrived, Charles said. And did she use them well?
Charles's mouth almost moved into a smile, but not quite.
That depends on one's goals.
William stepped farther into the room and closed the door behind him.
Vanessa did not wait for him to speak first. This has gone far enough, she said. I understand that you were caught off guard. I understand that emotions are high.
But if you intend to salvage anything from tonight, you need to stop acting like a stranger and start acting like the man I agreed to marry.
William looked at her for a long moment before responding. You make that sound like a favor.
Her eyes sharpened.
Don't do this. Do what?
She spread one hand, impatient now.
This cold performance. This interrogation. This stubborn need to turn an ugly interruption into some grand moral crisis.
She took a step closer.
William, listen to yourself.
A child ran into our wedding. A housekeeper from your staff has dredged up a story from years ago, and now you're standing here as though I've committed some kind of betrayal.
The irony of the word hung between them. William held up the photograph.
Vanessa's gaze flicked to it and away so quickly it might have escaped another man.
It did not escape him.
That story, he said, has a face.
It has a name. Daniel Brooks.
Vanessa gave a quiet sigh, as though burdened by his persistence rather than cornered by it.
If I knew a man by that name years ago, what does that prove? I have met people, William. I have lived a life before you. Did you have an affair with him?
Her silence lasted too long. Then she straightened and gave him the answer of someone who had decided precision was safer than denial.
I knew him.
The words dropped into the room like stones. Charles did not move, but William sensed him registering the shift.
A partial admission was rarely the end of anything.
Usually, it was the first door a guilty person opened when they realized the others would not stay locked.
How well? William asked.
Vanessa looked at him with visible frustration.
This is absurd. It's a simple question. He was unhappy, she said at last. We crossed paths. He pursued me. It didn't last. William did not blink. That's your version. It happens, William. Adults make mistakes. Men say their marriages are over when they aren't. Women believe them when they shouldn't. I am hardly the first person in Atlanta to be caught in a bad situation. He let the explanation finish before answering. Marissa didn't describe a bad situation.
She described a pattern.
Vanessa's expression changed at once. Marissa.
She spoke the name with quiet contempt.
So this is really about her. This is about you. No, this is about class, resentment, and projection.
Her voice gained force. A woman like that sees a woman like me and decides I must have stolen my place from someone. She hears that I'm marrying a man like you and suddenly the whole ugly machinery of envy starts turning.
Vanessa took another step. And you are letting it.
Charles finally spoke. Miss Hale, I'd advise against insulting the witness pool while the facts are still developing.
Vanessa cut him a look of such pure irritation that it almost amused William.
She had always preferred rooms where men smiled and let her glide over them. Charles, with his tidy patience and courtroom instincts, was probably the sort of man she disliked on sight. I am not interested in legal theater, she said.
That's unfortunate, Charles replied mildly. Because legal consequences tend to arrive whether people are interested in them or not.
William moved past both of them toward the desk at the far end of the room. He set the photograph down beside a bronze letter opener and turned back.
You told me in the garden that you had never seen Annie before. I hadn't.
She says she recognized you the first time you came to this house.
She's mistaken. She wasn't mistaken about Daniel Brooks. Vanessa's mouth thinned.
Children absorb what adults feed them.
William thought of Annie sitting straight-backed in the breakfast room.
Not theatrical, not coached, not confused. A child who had watched adults fail each other long before she should have needed to understand such things.
No, he said. They absorb what adults try to hide. For the first time, Vanessa did not immediately answer. William drew in a slow breath.
His anger wanted to outrun him, but anger had never built anything worth having.
Control had. Precision had. He would proceed the way he always did when truth was buried under charm. One question at a time. One crack widened until the whole structure gave way. When Daniel Brooks got sick, he said, "Were you still seeing him?" Her jaw set.
"I don't see what that has to do with my relationship with you."
"It has everything to do with it.
Because I refuse to be measured against the bitter memory of some dead man's failed marriage."
The sharpness of it changed the room.
Charles's head lifted slightly. William noticed, because he was trained to notice everything.
Vanessa noticed too late.
The line had gone too far, too fast, and not because it was cruel, but because it had revealed indifference where innocence should have lived.
William's voice cooled another degree. "You say that as if Daniel Brooks meant nothing at all."
Vanessa realized the mistake and corrected course.
"That is not what I meant." "No? Of course not."
"I mean only that whatever happened then has nothing to do with us now."
William gave her a long, unreadable look. "You really believe that?"
She hesitated. "I believe the past is often uglier when repeated by people who want something from it." Charles opened his portfolio at last. The sound of leather and paper seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He removed a notepad and a fountain pen, then glanced toward William.
"Would you prefer I begin now or later?"
Vanessa turned toward him, startled.
"Begin what?"
"A timeline," Charles said. "Known facts, prior contacts, any financial overlap."
"Depending on what Mrs. Brooks produces, possibly more." Vanessa stared at William.
"You called your attorney in to build a case against me." "I called my attorney because I was about to marry you."
And now, William's eyes did not leave hers. "Now I'm trying to determine who exactly I almost married."
The answer hit harder than he intended, which was perhaps why it was useful.
Something brittle moved through Vanessa's face. Not grief. Not heartbreak. Offense, certainly. Anger, undeniably.
But beneath both, fear. Not the fear of losing him, William thought, but the fear of losing position, access, security. The future she had expected to step into before Annie ran down the aisle and named the dead.
Vanessa's tone changed.
It softened, but now the softness sounded chosen, not natural. "William," she said, "please. We both know how these things work.
You are a visible man. I am a visible woman. If tonight turns into gossip, it won't just stain me. It stains you. Your family, your name, your judgment."
She took one measured step toward him.
"You can still contain this." There it was. Not sorrow. Not outrage. Strategy. "How?" he asked.
A fraction of relief entered her face, as though she believed he might still be brought back into alignment.
"You tell the guests there was a family emergency. You postpone the wedding quietly.
You let this ridiculous accusation die in private.
If you want distance, take distance. If you want time, take time.
But don't make this into a public spectacle based on the testimony of staff."
Staff.
William heard the word exactly as she meant it.
Not people. Not a mother. Not a child. Staff.
His face gave away nothing, but something inside him settled into place with finality. "You should choose your language more carefully," he said.
Vanessa blinked.
"I beg your pardon."
"You heard me." Her chin lifted. "What I heard is that you are willing to throw away everything over sentiment."
"No," William said.
"I'm willing to delay a wedding over evidence."
"So that's what this is."
"Evidence."
Her laugh was short and bitter.
"A photograph and a story from a woman who cleans your house."
Charles spoke before William could. "For the record, Miss Hale, dismissing a witness on the basis of employment status is rarely a sign of innocence." She swung toward him.
"You need to stop talking."
And you, Charles said calmly, need to stop assuming you're still in control of the room. The silence that followed was thick enough to feel. William reached into his jacket pocket and took out the ring box. He looked at it for only a second before setting it on the desk beside the photograph. Diamond and evidence. Promise and doubt. That pairing, laid side by side, seemed to tell the whole story of the evening. When Mrs. Brooks brings me what she has, he said, I'm going to review every piece of it. Charles will review every piece of it. And if there are holes in your story, I will find them. Vanessa stood very still. You already decided I'm guilty. No, he said. What I've decided is that you don't get the benefit of my trust anymore. The line struck home. He saw it. Trust mattered in worlds like his more than love ever did. Love could be performed. Trust could not. Once it broke, everything expensive and elegant built on top of it started to look flimsy. Vanessa looked at the ring box, then at the photograph, then back at him. And where am I supposed to go tonight? She asked. It was the first practical question she had asked. Maybe that made it the most honest. William answered without hesitation. The East Guest Suite for now. Mrs. Porter will have your things moved there. You do not enter my rooms. You do not speak to Annie or Marissa. You do not leave the property without informing Charles. She stared at him in disbelief. You're confining me. I'm controlling access. This is insane. This, William said quietly, is caution. You'd do well to learn the difference. Vanessa did not move. For 1/10 of a second, William thought she might refuse him outright. Then she turned, lifted her chin, and crossed the room with all the brittle dignity of a woman who would rather shatter than bend. At the door, she stopped and looked back at him. When this is over, she said, you are going to regret how you treated me. William met her gaze without flinching. That depends entirely on what comes next. She left without another word. The door closed softly behind her. For a few moments, neither man spoke. Then Charles capped his pen and looked at William across the shadowed library. Well, he said. That could have gone worse. William let out one breath. Charles considered the desk, the photograph, the ring box, the empty space where a bride had been standing. Yes, he said. She could have told the truth. William looked down at the photograph again. Daniel Brooks smiled up at him from another life, unaware that the woman beside him would one day stand in a wedding gown in William Ashford's library and try to explain that he had meant nothing. Marissa said she kept letters, William said. Good. She may have more. William rested both hands on the desk and bowed his head for a moment, not in defeat, but in concentration. He had spent years believing that danger arrived in contracts, competitors, bad debt, political pressure, and men greedy enough to mistake him for prey. He had not accounted for the quieter kind. The kind dressed in silk, carrying flowers, waiting to be invited inside. When he lifted his head again, the softness of a groom was gone entirely. Find everything, he said. Charles closed the portfolio. I will. Outside the library, the house continued its careful performance of normality. Inside it, the night had finally begun. Later that evening, after the last of the redirected guests had been served coffee and pecan pie, the Ashford estate began to quiet in the uneasy way large houses quiet after a scandal. Doors closed more softly. Voices lowered. Footsteps thinned out along the marble hall. Cars rolled down the drive one by one, headlights passing slowly through the trees beyond the front gates. By the time the final cluster of family friends had offered Eleanor their strained goodbyes and disappeared into the Georgia night, the house no longer felt like a wedding venue interrupted. It felt like a place waiting for judgment. William found Annie in the morning room just off the side terrace. Mrs. Porter had moved her there after supper, probably because the room was brighter and kinder than the breakfast room, with tall windows facing the back lawn and shelves lined with old gardening books, porcelain birds, and framed photographs of summers William barely remembered. The chandeliers in the front of the house were for entertaining. The library was for decisions. The morning room, at least in his mother's day, had been for quiet things that mattered. Annie sat in an armchair too large for her, though she did not look swallowed by it. She had tucked one leg beneath her and was staring out toward the dark garden where the wedding arch still stood under the trees, pale and ghostly in the reflection of the house lights. Someone had finally removed most of the candles and ribbons, but the white roses remained. From a distance, they looked less like celebration now than evidence. Marissa was in the adjoining pantry with Mrs. Porter, gathering the papers she had promised to bring. William had asked for everything, and in houses like his, when such a request was made, people moved carefully and quickly. When Annie noticed him in the doorway, she straightened but did not startle. "You're not asleep," William said. "Neither are you." It was not insolence. It was observation. William found himself almost appreciating it. He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. He had removed his jacket and tie, but he was still in the white shirt he had worn to the ceremony, sleeves rolled once at the forearms. The rose had been discarded. Without the flower and the jacket, without the wedding guests and the vows waiting to be spoken, he looked less like a groom and more like what he had always been. A man used to holding the weight of rooms together by force of will. Annie studied him for a second and then asked, "Did she lie again?" William leaned one shoulder against the mantel and considered the question. Children, he thought, had a way of walking straight past adult phrasing and asking for the part that mattered. "She admitted she knew your father," he said. Annie nodded once, as if that confirmed something she had already known all along. "I told you." "Yes," he said. "You did." The child looked back toward the garden. Grown-ups don't like believing kids. William might have denied it on instinct, but the day had stripped him of appetite for comfortable lies, especially his own. "No," he said after a moment. "Most of the time, they don't." Annie did not smile. She folded her hands in her lap and looked again at the ruined wedding setup outside. "Mama says people hear better when someone looks nice." The line settled into him with uncomfortable precision. "Your mother is a smart woman." "She has to be." There was no self-pity in it. Annie spoke the way some people learned to speak after they had watched enough to stop expecting fairness. William crossed the room and sat in the chair opposite hers, not because he was tired, though he was, but because standing above her felt wrong. There were conversations one could only have at eye level. "How long have you remembered Vanessa?" he asked. Annie thought about it. "Not all the time. Not like I remember my teachers or the bus driver. But I remembered her face when she came here the first time." She pointed vaguely toward the front of the house. "At the big dinner." William knew the night. A charity dinner, nearly 5 months earlier. He had introduced Vanessa to several board members and a former governor's wife. While the staff moved through the room with trays of crab cakes and bourbon cocktails, Marissa had been working that evening. Annie must have been somewhere in the service corridor or pantry, waiting for her mother to finish. "You didn't say anything then." Annie shook her head. "I wasn't sure at first." She looked richer here. Despite everything, that nearly pulled a laugh from him. Not because it was funny, but because it was devastatingly accurate. William understood exactly what she meant. Vanessa had existed in Daniel Brooks's life one way and entered the Ashford estate another, better dressed, better lit, polished by wealth and context until the past might almost be mistaken for rumor. Then Annie added, "But she had the same eyes." William leaned back slightly. "What do you mean by that?" "She looks at people like she already knows what she can get from them." The answer was so unnervingly precise that he forgot for a second the age of the person giving it. "Did your father know that?" Annie looked down at her hands. "Not at first." The room grew still again. Somewhere farther down the hall, a grandfather clock began to strike the hour, each note soft and distant through the walls. William listened until it was done. "What do you remember about him?" he asked. Annie's face changed then. Not into sadness exactly, but into concentration. The kind people wore when opening a drawer full of things they had not touched in a while. "He used to whistle in the kitchen," she said. "Not songs, right?" "Just little parts of them. He always smelled like soap and motor oil when he came home from work." She paused. When I was little, he'd put me on the grocery cart and let me hold the bread so it wouldn't get smashed.
William said nothing.
He had not expected memory to arrive in details like that.
Not grand declarations. Bread in a grocery cart. Soap. A whistle. Half remembered.
That was how real people stayed alive inside the people who loved them. Annie continued, still looking at her hands. Then, after he met her, he stopped whistling. The sentence was quiet, but it carried the whole architecture of a home falling apart.
William thought of all the language adults used to describe betrayal. Affairs. Entanglements. Poor decisions. Marital breakdown.
He had heard every polished phrase in divorce settlements and business scandals.
None of them said what a child's sentence did.
He stopped whistling.
Did he stop being kind to you? William asked. Annie took her time before answering. Not at first. He just got distracted.
Then he started promising things. She lifted her eyes.
That's worse sometimes.
He did not ask her what she meant.
He knew. A promise kept poorly could hollow out trust more efficiently than cruelty ever did. My mama says some people don't leave all at once, Annie said. They leave in pieces. William felt that one land, too.
Outside, the breeze shifted through the terrace hydrangeas and brushed the windows with a faint tapping of leaves. The wedding arch remained visible in the darkness, a pale shape under the trees, and for a moment he saw the whole day again, not as a public humiliation, but as a rescue he had not known he needed. A child had looked at a structure of roses, vows, and expensive certainty, and seen danger where the adults saw beauty.
Were you afraid today? He asked. Annie frowned as if the answer should have been obvious. Of course. Then why did you do it? She gave him a look that was almost puzzled. Because scared doesn't mean wrong.
William sat very still after that. He had spent his life around men who measured courage in bigger, louder terms.
Risk. Leverage. Litigation. Acquisition. Confrontation.
Yet nothing he had witnessed in years matched the moral clarity of a child running into a garden full of wealthy adults and refusing to let a life finish dressing itself as love. The door opened softly behind him. Marissa entered with a worn manila envelope in both hands, and Mrs. Porter behind her carrying a small tin box that might once have held Christmas ornaments or recipe cards. Both women stopped when they saw William seated across from Annie.
Speaking to her.
Not as one more member of staff's family, but as someone who belonged in the room. Mrs. Porter, sensible enough not to comment on what she saw, stepped forward and placed the tin box on the table beside William. Marissa held the envelope close to her chest for one last second before setting it down as well. "This is what I kept," she said quietly. "The picture, some letters, old money transfer stubs, and a few greeting cards. He wrote to Annie twice after he moved out.
I never answered them."
Her eyes flickered toward her daughter.
"I couldn't bear to."
William touched the edge of the envelope, but did not open it yet.
"Thank you."
Marissa nodded, though gratitude did not ease the strain in her face.
"I still don't know if I've done the right thing."
At that, Annie looked up at her mother and said with calm certainty, "You did." Marissa let out one breath that trembled at the edges.
William opened the envelope and slid the contents onto the low table one by one. A pharmacy receipt. A money order stub.
A folded hospital discharge paper.
A card with Daniel's handwriting, uncertain and slanted. 2 photographs.
One already familiar, and one newer, taken in poorer light.
In it, Daniel looked thinner.
Vanessa stood farther from him than she had in the first picture, as if distance had already begun to replace affection. William's eyes narrowed. Charles entered a moment later, carrying his leather portfolio, wearing the expression of a man who had expected evidence and was relieved to find it rather than rumor.
He took in the scene at once. The papers. The child. The mother. William's face.
And quietly shut the door behind him. "I take it," Charles said, "we've moved beyond instinct."
William picked up the second photograph and handed it to him.
Charles studied it under the lamp, then gave one small nod.
Good, he said. Not for the family, obviously. But good for the truth. Annie watched him closely. Are you the lawyer? Yes. Are you a good one?
Charles glanced at William, then back at her.
I bill as if I am.
To William's surprise, Annie gave the smallest hint of a smile. The room softened around the edges for only a second. But even that felt startling after the day they had survived.
Charles set the photograph down and opened his portfolio.
I'll need to make copies of all this first thing in the morning.
After that, I'll start building a proper timeline.
Contact, overlap, financial transfers, dates around the illness, any record tying Miss Hale to your father after the separation.
Marissa nodded. There may be more in storage. Boxes from the apartment. Then we'll get them. William looked at the documents spread across the table. At Annie sitting straight-backed in the oversized armchair. At Marissa trying to hold dignity and old grief in the same exhausted body. Then he looked at Charles. Tonight, he said, I want a full background review on Vanessa Hale. Not the one we already paid for. A real one. Charles's expression sharpened with professional focus. Understood.
No blind spots this time.
There won't be. William's hand closed over the edge of the envelope.
He had been warned today by someone society would train itself not to hear. A child attached to the invisible machinery of his household. That fact shamed him more than the broken wedding did.
He looked at Annie.
I should have listened sooner. She held his gaze without triumph.
You're listening now.
It was not forgiveness.
It was better than that. It was fact.
And for the first time since the garden went silent around a child's voice, William felt not the collapse of a future, but the beginning of a reckoning. The house was still dark when Charles Reed began making calls. By 6:30 the next morning, the Ashford estate had the strained stillness of a place trying to decide whether yesterday had been a scandal or a warning. The wedding arch still stood in the garden, pale and useless in the early light. A few white petals had blown across the stone path and settled near the fountain. Staff moved more quietly than usual, not because they had been told to, but because houses learned moods the way dogs learned weather. Something had changed at the center of this one, and everyone could feel it. William was already in his study when Charles arrived with a stack of folders under one arm and 2 paper coffee cups in the other. The study faced the eastern side of the property, where the morning sun reached first. It was one of the few rooms in the house that had always belonged entirely to William rather than to Ashford family taste. No floral wallpaper. No inherited silver. No attempts at softness. Just dark wood, leather, framed architectural drawings from his first hotel project, and the heavy desk where he had signed contracts that changed other people's futures long before he let anyone near his own. The ring box still sat in the top drawer, unopened since the night before. Charles set one cup down and took the chair across from him. I've been busy, he said. William took the coffee but did not drink it yet. Tell me. Charles opened the first folder. The short version is that Vanessa Hale is a real person, but not a complete one. William's gaze sharpened. Meaning? Meaning the name exists in enough places to pass a surface check, but too many details appear late. Clean credit history, but only in the last several years. Several addresses, but gaps between them. Employment references that look polished and respectable, yet strangely unconnected when you follow them backward. William leaned back slightly. Manufactured? Not fully. That would be easier. This is more interesting than that. Charles turned a page. She didn't invent herself from nothing. She edited. Which is what smart people do when they want the past to remain technically true while functionally useless. That sounded like Vanessa. Not reckless enough to fake an entire life. Just disciplined enough to blur it. Charles slid one sheet across the desk. I started with what we already had. County records, prior addresses, archived contact information, social and charitable appearances, bank-linked activity where accessible, and a cross-check on old phone registrations.
Then I widened the search. William picked up the page.
The names and dates meant little by themselves, but the pattern did not. Vanessa had moved often in her late 20s and early 30s, usually every 18 months to 2 years.
Apartments upgraded, then abandoned. Employment shifted from boutique marketing to event consulting to nonprofit fundraising.
Always adjacent to money, influence, or men who possessed both. She doesn't stay where the money runs out, William said. Charles nodded.
That would be my working theory. He opened the second folder. There's more.
Daniel Brooks was not the only man whose orbit she entered at a convenient moment.
I found 2 names worth noting so far. William looked up slowly.
One is a widower in Macon who sold commercial land after his wife died.
Vanessa appears in photographs from a church restoration fundraiser on his arm 6 months later.
She disappears from public association shortly after the sale closes. Charles turned another page.
The other is a retired dentist outside Savannah.
He changed his will twice in a year, then changed it back after his daughters intervened.
I've got reason to believe Vanessa was involved with him during the period those revisions were made. William stared at the papers. Did she take money?
Charles gave the careful lawyer's answer. Money left her interactions with those men in ways that benefited her.
Some direct, some indirect.
Paid rent, travel, jewelry, shared accounts that briefly existed and then vanished. Nothing criminal on its face, but a very consistent pattern of emotional timing paired with financial advantage. The study seemed smaller all at once. William had known from the moment Annie ran down the aisle that his humiliation might be deeper than a broken engagement.
He had not yet fully allowed himself to name the ugliest possibility.
That he had not been uniquely deceived. Only predictably selected. Charles watched him for a moment before continuing. You were never her first draft.
William finally took a sip of coffee. It had gone lukewarm already. What about Daniel?
Charles turned to another set of notes.
I found hospital records enough to confirm the broad outline.
Daniel Brooks was treated for complications related to untreated illness in the year before he died.
Financial stress is evident.
Missed prescriptions, delayed follow-ups, emergency contact information changed more than once.
No spouse listed by the end. William looked down. He thought of Annie's voice in the garden.
She wants your money, and then she'll leave you.
Not a child's tantrum. Not chaos for chaos's sake. A warning built from memory.
Charles continued. There's also evidence Daniel transferred money repeatedly during the final year before his death.
Small amounts at first, then larger ones relative to his income.
I can't yet prove where each payment went, but 2 money orders list a receiving address tied to one of Vanessa's former apartment buildings.
Can you tie it to her directly?
Probably, Charles said.
If the records still exist, yes. If not, then through overlapping dates, signed pickup forms, or tenancy documentation.
I've already got someone in Fulton County pulling archived housing files. William set the paper down and rubbed one thumb slowly against the edge of his coffee cup. And all of this got past the first background review. Charles did not flinch. The first review was designed to reassure a groom, not investigate a target.
That is not the same thing.
No, Charles said.
It isn't. Silence settled over the room.
Outside the windows, somewhere beyond the terrace, a groundsman's mower started and then stopped again.
The wedding lawn still had to be cut. Scandal or no scandal, grass kept growing. William looked toward the window. She knew exactly what she was doing. Yes. You sound certain. I sound experienced.
Charles leaned back and folded his hands. Women like Vanessa, and men like her too for that matter, rarely think of themselves as predators. They think of themselves as practical.
They study loneliness. They study vanity.
They study grief, timing, self-importance, the hunger to be admired again. Then they become whatever the person in front of them is most likely to trust.
William gave a humorless glance. What did she become for me? Charles's answer came without hesitation. Tasteful. Controlled. Unneeded. Impressed, but not too impressed. Gentle enough to suggest peace. Smart enough not to appear dazzled by power. She offered you admiration without making you feel handled. William did not deny it. That was exactly what Vanessa had done. She had never played the obvious games. She had not flattered him like an amateur. She had not clung. She had not begged. She had allowed him to feel chosen without ever seeming to pursue selection. Looking back on it now was like watching an elegant lock turn from the inside. Charles studied him. You're taking this personally. I was about to marry her. Yes, Charles said. That generally increases the level of personal involvement. William gave him a flat look, and Charles let the dryness pass. What about her current finances? William asked. Better than they should be, given the profile she presented. Charles tapped the folder. No stable career with serious earning history. No family money I can verify. Yet her personal spending suggests long periods of support or access. She's careful, though. She doesn't drain accounts like a fool. She prefers the slower path. Gifts, rent, travel, private expenses absorbed by someone else's generosity. He met William's eyes. Until marriage. Marriage would have simplified things considerably. The lines sat between them. William had structured his affairs carefully. Trusts, holdings, layers of separation. He was not stupid with money. But marriage changed the emotional terrain. Even when the legal protections held, access changed. Influence changed. Timing changed. A person at close range did not need to own everything to damage enough. He stood and crossed to the window. The rear garden stretched below, green and immaculate in the morning light, as though yesterday had not happened there. But from this angle, he could still see the white sweep of the arch and a scattering of chairs not yet removed. The visual residue of a life he had nearly stepped into. She said I'd regret how I treated her, he said. Charles stayed seated. Perhaps. Manipulative people often phrase failed control as moral injury. William turned back. And what do you call it? Charles closed the folder with quiet finality. A woman losing access before the paperwork is signed. The bluntness of it was ugly. It was also clarifying. A knock came at the study door. Mrs. Porter entered just enough to be seen. Sir, breakfast is being set in the sunroom. Miss Brooks asked if she should keep Annie upstairs for now. William glanced at Charles. Miss Brooks. Mrs. Porter, who had likely been listening to the house all morning the way capable women did, merely inclined her head. Yes, sir. Tell Marissa to keep Annie with her. No one speaks to Miss Hale without my knowledge. No one. Of course. She withdrew quietly. William returned to the desk and looked down at the folders. Macon. Savannah. Daniel Brooks. Addresses. Transferred money. Revised wills. Old patterns wearing new silk. Keep going, he said. I want names, dates, everything. I want to know when the pattern began and how close she came to repeating it here. Charles stood. You'll have it. As he gathered the folders, William opened the top drawer and looked once at the ring box inside before closing it again. Yesterday, he had thought the greatest danger in the room was humiliation. Now he understood it had been proximity. Not the woman at the altar, but the lie standing close enough to touch. William found Marissa in the service kitchen just before noon, standing at the long butcher block counter beneath the bright windows that faced the herb garden. The kitchen had always been the most honest room in the house. Whatever happened in the formal dining room, whatever smiles were worn in the front hall, whatever polished version of life the Ashford estate presented to the world, the truth usually passed through here first. Coffee was poured here before funerals.
Meals were packed here for people too sick to come downstairs. Staff whispered here when guests had gone too far with bourbon or family arguments had turned sharp enough to leave marks in the air. The service kitchen did not care about elegance. It cared about what still needed doing. Marissa was slicing peaches into a bowl, though from the stiffness in her shoulders, William could tell she had probably been cutting the same fruit longer than necessary, simply because her hands needed a task. A pot of grits sat warming at the back of the stove. Bacon crackled on a tray lined with paper towels. Someone had set out biscuits under a cloth. Mrs. Porter was nowhere in sight, which meant she had understood that this conversation needed privacy. When Marissa noticed him in the doorway, she straightened at once and put the knife down. "Mr. Ashford." "Marissa." He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. The smell of butter, coffee, and peach skins hung in the warm air. Outside, a mockingbird landed on the stone ledge by the window, then flew off again. "You don't need to stop working on my account," he said. For the first time since the garden, something almost like irritation crossed her face. Not at him exactly. At the sentence itself. At the long habit of being told to take care of the household even when her own life was shaking. "I'm not doing it for you, sir," she said quietly. "I'm doing it because if I sit too still, I'll think." William nodded once. He respected that answer. He crossed to the counter but did not sit. "Charles found more this morning." Marissa's hand tightened around the edge of the towel beside the peaches. "About her?" "Yes." She let out a slow breath. "I figured there would be." William studied her for a moment. In the grander rooms of the house, Marissa often seemed to disappear into the machinery of service, refilling a glass before anyone noticed it was empty, adjusting flowers, directing linens, answering the door with calm dignity. But here, in the clear daylight of the kitchen, he could see the force it must have taken for her to build a life after the kind of humiliation she had described. She was not fragile. She was exhausted in an old, practiced way. There was a difference. "She's done this before," he said. "Not only with Daniel." Marissa looked up slowly. "Of course she has." The certainty in her voice stopped him. "You're not surprised?" "No, sir." She turned back to the peaches and adjusted the bowl, simply to have something to do with her hands. "Women like that don't ruin one home by accident and then retire from the business." The phrasing would have sounded bitter from someone else. From Marissa, it sounded earned. William rested one palm on the counter. "Tell me what you saw then. Not just what Daniel did. What you saw in her." Marissa gave a small, humorless smile. "You want to know how she works?" "Yes." She was quiet for several seconds. The bacon grease popped softly behind them. Somewhere farther down the hall, a pantry door opened and closed. "When I first saw her," Marissa said at last, "I thought she looked too expensive for the places Daniel could afford." William said nothing. "She wasn't rich then." "Not really. But she knew how to borrow the look of it. Hair always done, nails clean, shoes that cost more than they should have. A voice that could change depending on who was listening." Marissa picked up one peach slice and set it back down again without eating it. She knew how to talk to men like they were better versions of themselves. Not the men they were, but the men they wished they had become. That landed harder than she probably realized. William thought of Vanessa at dinners, on terraces, in quiet corners of his house. Never challenging him directly when she could guide instead. Always making admiration feel like understanding. Daniel wasn't a rich man, Marissa went on. But he was a proud one. She made him feel important. Not useful. Important. There's a difference. William looked at her. "And you saw that." "I lived with it." She wiped her hands on the towel and turned to face him fully now. Tired, but steady. Men don't always leave home because someone prettier comes along. Sometimes they leave because someone new makes them feel less small than life has made them feel. He had the uncomfortable sense that she was no longer speaking only about Daniel. Marissa seemed to recognize that too. Her eyes shifted slightly, not away from him, but inward, toward some private calculation about how much truth a man like William could take without retreating into offense.
My husband worked hard, she said. But hard work doesn't always turn into dignity in this country.
Sometimes it turns into bills and back pain and a truck that keeps breaking down. Sometimes a man starts feeling like every room reminds him of what he hasn't managed to be.
She folded the towel once, very precisely.
Then along comes somebody who looks at him like he's already enough. William's expression did not change, but inwardly something moved. This was not merely a story about seduction. It was about weakness shaped by class, shame, race, exhaustion, longing, and the hunger to escape ordinary disappointment. He could see how Daniel Brooks might have been vulnerable to it. He could also, with increasing disgust, see how Vanessa had studied that vulnerability and used it. Marissa watched his face carefully.
You're wondering what any of this has to do with you. I know what it has to do with me. Do you?
The question was gentle, which made it harder to resist.
William looked toward the window. Rosemary. Sage. Thyme.
All trimmed neatly by the grounds crew.
All useful. All ordinary. She never flattered me in obvious ways, he said. That would have bored me.
She made herself seem rare. Marissa nodded once, as if she had expected exactly that.
Calm, he said. Tasteful. Unimpressed by money, at least on the surface. She never asked for much directly. Never behaved like someone trying to win.
His mouth hardened.
That was probably the point. Yes, sir. He looked back at her.
You don't sound as though any of this surprises you.
No.
Marissa's voice remained level. Because women like me are expected to notice certain things faster than women like her are. William's eyes narrowed slightly.
What does that mean?
For the first time, something sharper entered her expression.
Not disrespect.
Weariness sharpened into truth. It means, she said, that poor black women do not get the luxury of believing charm without checking the price tag. It means we are taught early to look at what somebody wants, not just how they smile.
It means we know the difference between kindness and appetite because too often we've had to survive the second one dressed up as the first.
The room went very quiet. William absorbed her words without interruption.
They did not feel like accusation, though accusation lives nearby.
They felt like a map to a country he had spent his life walking past without entering.
Marissa saw that he was listening and went on more quietly. When Daniel started changing, people did not look at me and think something must be wrong. They looked at me and thought, well, maybe she wasn't enough. Maybe he found better.
Maybe if she had been prettier, softer, less tired after a shift, less worn down from worrying about rent, he would have stayed. She lifted one shoulder. The world is very efficient at explaining why women like me are left.
William's jaw tightened.
She looked down at the peaches again.
That's why I kept the picture.
That's why I kept the receipts.
Because I knew one day, if the truth needed to be spoken, my word alone would not be treated like truth. He thought of Annie's line from the night before. Mama says people hear better when someone looks nice. Not just nice. He realized now. White. Elegant. Belonging. Protected by the assumptions people wrapped around beauty and money. Annie recognized her immediately, he said. Yes. Before you did. Marissa's expression softened then, not with shame, but with maternal recognition. Children remember pain the way grown people remember addresses. They may not always know the right words for it, but they know the road back to it when they see it. William let out a slow breath.
He had spent years believing judgment came from experience, power, exposure to risk. Yet the clearest moral instinct in his house had belonged to Annie. Not because she understood law or money or reputation, but because she remembered what ruin looked like before adults had time to call it complicated. From the doorway came a small movement.
Both turned.
Annie stood there in the threshold, one hand still resting on the frame. She had apparently heard at least the last part of the conversation, But her face showed no embarrassment at that.
Only attention.
I came to ask if Mama was almost done, she said. Mrs. Porter said the laundry room ladies need the table. Marissa immediately straightened.
I'll be right there.
Annie's eyes moved from her mother to William.
Did the lawyer find more? William answered honestly. Yes. About other men?
This time, even Marissa looked startled.
Annie gave a small shrug. People don't usually get that good at bad things by trying them only once.
For a second, no one spoke. Then Marissa let out the kind of tired breath that might have become a laugh if the subject had been lighter.
Lord, help me, she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. William looked at Annie carefully. You've thought about this. I've watched. There it was again. Not childishness, but witness. He asked, Are you afraid she'll try to talk to you? Annie shook her head once. No. Why not?
Because now she knows you believe me. The certainty of it settled the room in a different way than silence had done all morning. Marissa turned toward her daughter, and for the first time since the wedding interruption, William saw something ease slightly in her face.
Not relief exactly.
More like the terrible loneliness of being disbelieved had finally loosened its grip by one small degree.
William pushed away from the counter. No one speaks to Vanessa without my knowing it, he said. That includes both of you.
If she approaches either of you, I want to hear about it immediately.
Marissa nodded. Yes, sir.
Annie nodded too, but then added, You should be careful, too.
William looked at her. Why?
Because she almost married you. The simplicity of the statement struck with more force than any warning Charles had given him.
Almost married you. Almost entered everything.
Almost moved from guest suite to master rooms.
From invitations to influence.
From proximity to permanence. William glanced toward the back hall, toward the larger house that had once felt entirely his because his name was on the deed and his history in the walls.
It no longer felt simple.
Not because he feared losing it, but because he had finally begun to understand how easily danger could arrive through approval rather than threat.
He looked back at Annie. Yes, he said. I intend to be careful.
And this time when he said it, he meant something larger than caution with documents or locked doors.
He meant he would stop confusing polish with character.
He meant he would stop assuming truth came dressed for the front rooms of the house. He meant, though he could not yet have put it so plainly, that he was beginning to see the people who had always been nearest to the work of holding his life together, and farthest from the dignity of being fully believed. By late afternoon, the files on Charles Reed's desk had begun to tell a story uglier than rumor and much more disciplined than chance.
He had taken over the smaller office adjoining William's study.
A practical room with built-in cabinets, 2 legal pads already half-filled, and enough outlet strips and chargers to suggest that truth in modern America depended as much on county archives and subscription databases as it did on human memory. The desk was crowded now with printouts, timelines, photocopies of old signatures, county property notes, and a yellow folder labeled simply, Hail. Beside it sat a paper cup of gas station coffee gone cold and a bakery box someone from the kitchen had sent up, untouched except for one missing biscuit. William stood at the window while Charles sorted another stack. The wedding arch had finally been removed. Groundsmen had dismantled it in the heat of the afternoon and taken the white roses away in plastic bins. From above, the lawn looked almost respectable again. A person driving past the gates that evening would never have guessed that the same grass had held a broken ceremony, a frightened warning, and the first crack in a lie polished for months. Charles slid a page free and tapped it once. I have enough now to stop calling it coincidence.
William turned from the window. Go on.
Charles adjusted his glasses and read from the file, though by now he clearly knew most of it by heart. First, there was Robert Leland.
Age 58 at the time. Commercial land owner in Macon. Wife died after a long cancer illness.
Within 7 months, he appears in photographs at 2 public events with Vanessa, using the same name, which is interesting in itself. He paid the lease on an apartment she occupied for 14 months. There are also florist receipts, jewelry purchases, and 2 domestic travel bookings tied to his card. Charles looked up. 3 months after he sold the property, she vanished from his life.
Did he contest anything? No. Men in his position seldom do. Pride is expensive. William said nothing.
Charles continued. Then there's Dr. Stephen Mercer.
Retired dentist outside Savannah.
Widower.
Adult daughters. A will revision appears 18 months after his wife's death. A second revision appears 6 months later. Both increased an unnamed personal bequest that was later removed after family intervention.
He lifted another page. During the same period, Vanessa shared an address with him part-time and charged several personal expenses to an account connected to a trust-managed card.
William crossed to the desk. And Daniel Brooks.
Charles put down the Mercer file and lifted the thinner, sadder folder. Daniel is the least financially powerful of the 3, which may be why his case matters most.
It proves she does not only target wealth. She targets vulnerability. Wealth is ideal. Need is sufficient. That line stayed in the room for a second.
Charles continued. Daniel was employed, proud, strained, and increasingly ashamed of what he had not become, which made him easier to flatter and easier to drain. The money transfers were modest compared to the others, but proportionally worse.
He could not afford the generosity he was performing.
William thought of Marissa in the kitchen, speaking with the quiet clarity of people who had once been denied the luxury of denial. Women like me are expected to notice certain things faster than women like her are. Poor black women do not get the luxury of believing charm without checking the price tag.
What about after he got sick? William asked.
Charles's face hardened.
That part is ugly. William gave him a flat look. I assumed as much. Hospital intake shows delayed treatment. Missed follow-up visits. A gap in prescription refills that suggests money trouble or neglect.
One note indicates he listed a friend as support contact, but that number was disconnected within 2 months.
The timing overlaps with the last known financial transfer out of his account.
William held very still. In plain English, Charles said, he kept giving until he couldn't. And once he couldn't, she became difficult to locate.
The study seemed colder despite the warm Georgia evening beyond the glass.
There was a knock at the half-open adjoining door. Mrs. Porter appeared with a tray carrying fresh coffee, 2 plates, and a casserole dish whose smell reached the room before she did.
Cook sent chicken pot pie, she said. No one has eaten properly since breakfast, and that includes both of you.
Charles rose halfway, perhaps out of instinctive respect for women who had kept large houses civilized for decades.
You're saving the Republic.
I'm feeding 2 men who confuse caffeine with judgment, she replied, setting the tray down. Then more quietly to William, Marissa is upstairs with Annie. They won't come down while Miss Hale is still on the east side.
William nodded. That's fine. Mrs. Porter hesitated only a second. Annie asked if the bad lady had always been bad.
Charles looked at William.
William looked at the tray.
What did you tell her?
That some people learn early how to take without seeming to.
Mrs. Porter's expression did not change. Children understand more when you speak plainly.
She left before either man could respond. Charles exhaled through his nose.
She should have been a judge.
She still could be.
For a moment, the ordinary comfort of pot pie and fresh coffee softened the room. Then Charles opened another file and the softness vanished. There's more, he said.
Vanessa did not merely leave after the money dried up.
In at least 2 cases, she appears to have positioned herself as the only person who really understood the man involved.
She isolated by refinement.
Maid daughters seem grasping.
Old friends seem dull. Ex-wives bitter. Ordinary obligations suffocating. William sat down at last. She didn't ask for anything obvious from me.
No, Charles said.
That's because by the time she met you, she no longer needed obvious.
He laid out the pattern carefully, almost academically, as though naming it plainly would rob it of some of its power.
Vanessa entered men's lives at moments of transition. After a death. Before a sale. During loneliness. During vanity. During midlife reinvention. After emotional fatigue. Before legal changes. She made herself useful without looking eager. She admired without appearing starstruck. She cultivated taste rather than dependence. Then, once trust had settled in, she shifted the emotional ground under them until giving to her felt like proof of their own worth. William listened without interrupting. He recognized the architecture now. Not because Charles was explaining it, but because he had lived inside it. Vanessa had never crowded him. She had never insisted. She had made room for his habits, admired his discipline, praised his restraint as though it were rare and noble rather than simply familiar to him. Looking back, he could now see the precision in every gesture. She had not sold herself as romance. She had sold herself as peace. Did she ever get married before? He asked. No legal record of it, Charles said, flipping 2 pages. At least one engagement that appears to have dissolved quietly. Possibly 2. I'm still confirming. William rested his forearms on the desk and looked down at the names spread in black ink. Robert Leland. Stephen Mercer. Daniel Brooks. Men from different worlds, different incomes, different levels of polish. One thing in common. Each had been susceptible to being seen at exactly the right angle. What did she take from Daniel besides money? He asked. Charles closed the file partway. Respectability. Self-deception. Time. Whatever was left of the part of him that understood home was not the place trapping him, but the place that had once loved him best. William looked up. That line isn't in the records, he said. No, Charles answered. That came from listening. Silence settled between them again. Thicker now. More human. At last, William pushed back from the desk and stood. Has she asked to leave? Twice. She says staying under household restriction is degrading. And I explained that my concern for her comfort has been reduced by recent evidence. A short breath escaped William. Not a laugh, but close enough to register as one. Charles removed a single photograph from the Mercer folder and slid it across the desk. Vanessa stood beside an older man in a navy blazer, smiling up at him during some regional museum fundraiser. Same angle of the chin. Same carefully attentive eyes. Same expensive understatement. Only the target had changed. William stared at it for a long time. Do you know what bothers me most? He said finally. Charles waited. It isn't that she lied. People lie. He looked at the photograph, then passed it back. It's that she counted on the world helping her lie. On beauty. On class. On the fact that Marissa would sound bitter and Annie would sound disruptive, and she would sound reasonable. Charles's expression shifted, not with surprise, but with approval. Yes, he said. That's exactly what she counted on. William thought of front staircases and back hallways. Of who got called staff and who got called guests. Of who was expected to apologize first in any room. Of how quickly his family had tried to restore order, not because order was truth, but because order was more comfortable than truth. He walked back to the window. Below, the servants' drive curved toward the rear wing, where laundry was done, deliveries received, and household life actually functioned. Beyond it lay the front circle with its stone fountain and polished entrance where guests arrived and left believing the visible parts of a house were the important ones. He had spent years mastering visible things. Behind him, Charles closed another folder. There is one more detail, he said. William turned. She kept overlapping. Not always physically, but emotionally, financially, strategically. She rarely let one possible future go before testing the next one. With Mercer, there's evidence she was already positioning toward Leland. With Daniel, she may have been speaking to someone else before he fully collapsed. And with you. Charles paused. There are indications she maintained contact with at least one former connection while planning the wedding.
Something in William's face changed.
Who? I don't have the name cleanly yet. Burner number. Partial metadata. A dinner reservation.
One florist invoice sent to a secondary email. Enough to confirm there was a line open somewhere.
William's jaw tightened. There it was. The final vulgarity.
Not merely a woman lying to win a wealthy husband, but a woman keeping side doors unlocked while standing at the altar.
He looked at the pot pie, untouched on the tray. At the fading light outside.
At the files bearing the names of men who had mistaken being chosen for being loved.
"Bring me everything on that contact," he said.
Charles nodded.
"I already am." William picked up the Mercer photograph once more, then set it face down. "By tomorrow," he said, "I don't want impressions anymore.
I want proof strong enough that when I put it in front of her, she understands there is nowhere left to hide." Charles gathered the folders into a tighter stack.
Understood.
When he left, the room grew quiet again, except for the faint sound of dishes being washed somewhere below stairs. William remained at the desk, staring at the face-down photograph and the names in the files. Outside, evening lowered itself over the estate in soft southern light.
Somewhere upstairs, Annie was likely asking direct questions no adult would answer comfortably. Somewhere in the East guest suite, Vanessa Hale was almost certainly calculating. William no longer mistook calculation for innocence.
And now, for the first time since the garden, he understood that what Annie had saved him from was not simply one false marriage. She had saved him from becoming the next man in a file. Stay with Storyverse.
There is more to come.
The next morning arrived gray and close, with low clouds pressing over the estate and the kind of humid stillness that made even the garden seem to be holding its breath.
William had slept little.
He had spent part of the night in his study, reviewing copies of the files Charles had assembled. Then another hour sitting in the dark with a glass of untouched bourbon on the table beside him, listening to the house settle around him. Pipes clicked. Air shifted through vents. Somewhere in the rear corridor, a door opened softly and closed again. Every sound seemed more distinct after betrayal. Perhaps that was one of its cruelties. It taught a man to hear danger in ordinary things.
By morning, the guests were gone.
The florists had taken the last of the wedding arrangements away, and the Ashford estate had resumed its normal appearance so completely that a stranger might have thought nothing at all had happened there. But William knew better. A place could look restored long before the people inside it were.
He found Annie on the back terrace just after breakfast.
She was sitting cross-legged on one of the wicker chairs with a plate balanced carefully on her knees. On it lay half a biscuit, 2 strips of bacon, and a small pile of sliced strawberries. A glass of milk sat on the table beside her, sweating in the heavy air. The lawn beyond the terrace rolled quiet and green toward the trees. The wedding arch was gone now. Only faint marks in the grass showed where it had stood. Annie glanced up when she heard him, then returned her eyes to the plate.
"You're up early," William said. "So are you."
He took the chair across from her.
For a few moments they sat without speaking. The estate felt different in the morning light. Less like a stage. More like a house that had survived something unpleasant and had not yet decided how to feel about it. Somewhere inside, silverware clinked softly as breakfast was cleared. A lawn crew worked far enough away to be little more than a distant hum. William noticed Annie had broken one strip of bacon in half and placed part of it carefully to the side of the plate. "You don't like bacon?" he asked. "I do." He looked at the half she had set aside. "Then why aren't you eating it?"
Annie glanced at it, then back at him, as though the answer were obvious.
"I might want it later."
William said nothing, but something quiet and unpleasant moved through him.
He had noticed it before.
Once or twice in passing.
The way Annie did not rush food even when she was clearly hungry.
The way she folded napkins neatly around leftovers without being asked. The way she watched what adults left on serving platters, not greedily, but with the alert attention of someone who had learned that plenty was not always permanent.
"You don't have to save it," he said. "There's more in the kitchen." Annie shrugged one shoulder. I know. But I'm saving it anyway. Yes. Her voice was calm. Matter of fact. No self-pity. No drama. William had begun to understand. That was often the hardest kind of truth to hear. He leaned back slightly in the chair. Your mother made breakfast this morning. She helped Mrs. Porter, and you came outside. She said I was pacing. That almost drew a smile from him. Were you? A little. William looked out over the terrace rail toward the lawn. Why? Annie took a sip of milk before answering. Because bad things don't stop all at once. They stop in pieces. The sentence was spoken in the same even tone she used for everything else, but it hit him harder than it should have. He thought of Vanessa in the East guest suite. Of Charles still pulling at threads. Of Marissa moving carefully through the house as though one wrong sound might reopen a wound she had just barely managed to close. You think this isn't over, he said. Annie looked at him steadily. Do you? No, he thought. Not yet. But he did not say it that way. I think the truth takes longer than lies do. Annie considered that. Mama says lies get there first because they don't carry anything heavy. William let out a slow breath that might have become a laugh on another day. Your mother says a lot of smart things. She had to learn them. There it was again. That clear-eyed understanding that seemed older than the person sitting across from him. William studied the child more closely. Annie was not difficult to read in the usual ways. She did not sulk. She did not perform hurt to draw adults closer. She simply observed, remembered, and said what she believed to be true. It made her unusually dangerous to liars and unusually inconvenient to people who preferred comfort over honesty. Were you worried I wouldn't believe you? He asked. Yes. The answer came without hesitation. He nodded once. Why? Annie looked down at the biscuit in her hand and turned it over once before setting it back on the plate. Because most grown-ups don't like hearing ugly things at pretty times. The line sat between them in the thick morning air. It was such a clean way to say it. More precise than the vocabulary adults tended to use when they wanted to sound nuanced. William thought of the white roses. The polished chairs. The string music. The pearl buttons on Vanessa's dress. Ugly things at pretty times. That was exactly what the wedding had become the moment Annie stepped into the aisle. And if I had gone ahead with it, he asked. Annie looked at him for a long second before speaking. Then I would have known I tried. He felt that somewhere low and uncomfortable in his chest. You weren't afraid of getting in trouble. I was. But you did it anyway. She frowned slightly, as if the distinction itself were strange. Those are two different things. William lowered his gaze for a moment. In his world, courage usually announced itself wearing a better suit. It came with negotiations, public pressure, financial risk, legal aggression, political maneuvering. It had shape and polish, and often a very expensive watch. Yet the bravest act he had seen in recent memory involved a child in a blue dress interrupting a wedding full of rich adults who would much rather have called her rude than right. Annie picked up one strawberry slice and ate it slowly. Then she asked, Did she talk to you again? Yes. What did she say? That she knew my name better than yours. That the story was unfair. That I was making a mistake. Annie nodded as if all of that had been predictable. Did she cry? No. She probably wanted to. Why do you think that? Because crying works better when people still feel sorry for you. William looked at her sharply. Annie met his gaze without flinching. I've seen ladies do that before. Not just her. He thought of dinners. Fundraisers. Divorces negotiated in private. Men in expensive shoes making poor choices because they preferred being needed to being respected. Annie might not have known the legal language, but she understood motive with unnerving clarity. What else have you seen? He asked.
She shrugged again. People act different around other people than they do when they think no one important is looking.
The statement was so accurate that it almost embarrassed him.
Not because she meant him, though perhaps she did, because she meant all of them. The guests who had wanted the ceremony to continue. The relatives who had tried to smooth over truth with manners. Vanessa, who had looked wounded until the room began slipping from her and then sharpened into accusation. Even William himself. If he was honest, he had almost chosen order over inquiry because inquiry had looked ugly in public.
Annie must have seen something shift in his face because she asked, "Are you mad at me?" "No." "Were you?"
He took his time with that.
"At first, I was startled. Then I was angry that my wedding had been interrupted." He paused. "Now I'm angry for a different reason." "What reason?" "That you had to be the one to do it."
Annie looked at him for a moment, and for the first time since he had known her, some of the hard alertness in her eyes eased.
"You would have found out later," she said. "That's not the same thing."
"No," she agreed.
"It isn't." A breeze moved across the terrace, gentle enough to stir the edge of the tablecloth and lift a loose curl near Annie's temple.
She pushed it back without thinking. William leaned forward and rested his forearms on his knees.
"Annie." "Yes, sir." "You don't have to call me sir." She blinked.
"What should I call you?" The question was so direct it nearly caught him off guard. In business, people called him Mr. Ashford.
"William." "Mr. Ashford, sir."
Depending on the room and the degree of courage involved.
Very few people asked him what he preferred. "William is fine," he said.
She thought about that seriously, the way children sometimes did when adults least expected it.
"Mama wouldn't like that."
The answer was so immediate and practical that he found himself smiling despite everything. "Then Mr. Ashford is acceptable," he said.
Annie nodded, satisfied by the compromise.
She finished another piece of bacon, then folded the remaining half in her napkin with neat, economical hands. William watched her do it and knew better now than to object.
Some habits were not really about hunger.
They were about history. He rose from his chair.
Annie looked up at once. "Are you leaving? To talk to the lawyer?" "Yes." She nodded once.
"Good." The word held no warmth or coldness. It was simply her judgment on what needed doing.
William hesitated, then said, "Annie." She waited.
"You were right." Children, he had learned, did not always need long speeches when adults finally admitted the truth.
They only needed the truth admitted plainly. Annie accepted it that way. "I know," she said.
And because there was nothing arrogant in it, nothing smug, the answer did not irritate him at all. It steadied him. As he turned back toward the house, he understood something he had been resisting since the garden.
Annie had not only exposed Vanessa.
She had exposed the machinery around Vanessa.
The assumptions. The manners.
The class reflexes. The convenient blindness of people who preferred a graceful lie to a disruptive truth.
Including him.
Behind him, Annie picked up her glass of milk and drank the last of it without hurry. Inside the house, Charles would be waiting with more files, more names, more proof.
Vanessa would still be in the East Wing.
And Marissa would still be moving through a house where she had worked for years, as though she were trying not to take up too much room inside the consequences of her own truth. But on the terrace, in the soft morning heat, one thing had become clear to William Ashford in a way it had not been clear before.
Annie had understood first.
Not because she was older, richer, smarter in the world's approved ways, or harder than the rest of them. She had understood first because she knew what it looked like when love was being imitated badly. By noon, the house had settled into the kind of strained order that looked calm from the outside and felt brittle everywhere else.
The Ashford estate was functioning again. Lunch was being prepared.
Sheets from the guest wing had been changed. A florist truck had come and gone, taking away the last evidence of the interrupted wedding. In the formal rooms, lamps had been adjusted, side tables straightened, and every visible sign of disorder quietly corrected. Yet the deeper rhythm of the house had changed. Staff voices stayed lower. Doors were opened with more care. Footsteps paused outside rooms where they ordinarily would have passed without thought. No one said Miss Hale's name unless it was necessary. William stood at the long window in his study and watched clouds gather over the back lawn. The heat had thickened through the morning, and the air now carried the heavy stillness that often came before a southern storm. Beyond the terrace, the grass still showed faint pale marks where the wedding chairs had once been lined in perfect rows. If a stranger had been invited in at that hour, he would have seen a restored estate, elegant and orderly, and assumed the world inside it remained intact. But William no longer trusted surfaces simply because they had been expertly maintained. Behind him, Charles Reed laid 3 fresh documents across the desk. "We have the contact," Charles said. William turned from the window. Charles tapped the first page. "The unnamed line we found yesterday belongs to a man named Gregory Vale. 52. Private investor. 2 residences, one in Buckhead, one on the coast near Charleston. Divorced. No children. Extremely discreet, in the way men like him think counts as wisdom." William crossed to the desk. "Current?" "Yes." Charles adjusted the papers into a neat stack. "Dinner reservation in his name 6 weeks ago. Secondary email linked to a florist invoice for white orchids delivered to a private address Vanessa used before your engagement was publicly announced. Burner phone traffic overlaps with a period when she was finalizing plans here." William stared at the printed dates. "So, while she was planning a wedding to me, she was maintaining a line to someone else." Charles gave a small nod. "Not merely maintaining. Testing, most likely. Keeping options alive." William felt the familiar cold settle lower in his chest. Betrayal had already become a fact. This, however, gave it another shade. Less dramatic. More contemptible. Not passion. Not confusion. Inventory management. He picked up one of the pages and read Gregory Vale's profile more closely. Private equity. Selective philanthropy. Luxury property holdings. Club memberships. Coastal retreat. Recent separation. No immediate family close by. Vanessa's pattern was so clean it almost offended him with its elegance. "She chooses transition points," he said. "Yes. Grief, illness, divorce, ego, loneliness. Men who want to feel central again." Charles met his gaze. "And men who are used to being obeyed but not necessarily understood. Those are often the easiest to flatter convincingly." William set the paper down. There was no accusation in Charles's tone, which somehow made the truth harder to dismiss. Vanessa had not stumbled into his life. She had assessed it. The scale of his wealth mattered, certainly. But so did his habits. His privacy. His controlled routines. The emotional vacancy people around him had learned to treat as permanent. She had not offered chaos to disrupt his world. She had offered refinement to slip inside it. A knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Porter stepped in carrying a silver tray with fresh coffee and 2 glasses of iced water. She placed them quietly on the side table. But before she could leave, William said, "Has Miss Hale remained in the East Suite?" "Yes, sir." "Any attempt to contact staff?" Mrs. Porter hesitated just enough for him to notice. She asked one of the junior maids whether the front gates had been reopened to visitors. "The girl sent word to me instead of answering." "Good." Mrs. Porter nodded. She also requested her phone twice and asked whether a driver could be made available this afternoon. "And I told her I would need your approval, sir." William's expression did not change. "She doesn't get it." "No, sir." Mrs. Porter withdrew, closing the door softly behind her. Charles waited until the latch clicked into place. "She's preparing to move, or to warn someone." "Possibly both." The storm clouds outside thickened another degree. William sat at his desk and opened the top drawer. The ring box was still there, untouched. Beside it, a set of guest wing keys Mrs. Porter had insisted on returning that morning out of formality. He looked at both for a second, then shut the drawer again. "What else?" he asked. Charles pulled a legal pad closer. "Gregory Vale isn't the only parallel line. He's just the cleanest. I also found evidence of recent communication with a woman named Celeste Morano." William frowned. "Why does that matter?" "Because Miss Morano runs private placement introductions for wealthy men who prefer their companionship discreet, polished, and socially acceptable." Charles let the sentence settle. "In plainer terms, she brokers access. Not prostitution, not in any easily chargeable sense. Something more refined, and therefore harder to touch." William sat very still. So Vanessa wasn't only operating for herself. Not necessarily. At minimum, she still had ties to a network that knew how to place women in the right rooms. The room felt suddenly much less domestic. William had been thinking in terms of betrayal at the scale of intimacy. A false fiancé. A manipulated engagement. A woman who fed on loneliness and greed. But this pushed the matter wider. It suggested system, not merely appetite. Vanessa might still be the architect of her own choices. But she had not been improvising in a vacuum. She had learned from somewhere. She had been shaped, sharpened, perhaps even circulated. He stood again and moved back toward the window. Rain had not begun yet, but the garden had turned that peculiar silver-green color that always came right before the first drop. Somewhere in the trees, birds had gone quiet. Even the grounds crew had disappeared. "When do we confront her?" he asked. Charles closed the folder. "Soon, but not half-hearted. Right now, she still believes she can control the emotional frame. If we confront too early, she pivots to injury. Dignity. Humiliation. Misunderstanding. You already saw the beginning of that in the library." William remembered every second of it. Vanessa insisting the wedding continue. Vanessa reframing interruption as cruelty toward herself. Vanessa asking whether Annie was his daughter, not out of fear, but calculation. A woman skilled at moving the room away from the truth and toward the comfort of her image. "I want her to know," William said slowly, "that I understand what she is." Charles gave a short nod. "Then we don't simply accuse. We sequence." William turned back. "Meaning?" "We present the pattern, not the scandal. Daniel Brooks first, because she already knows that line is broken. Then Leland, Mercer, Vale, and finally the active overlap during your engagement. Each step makes denial less credible. Each prior man reduces the emotional uniqueness of her relationship with you. That matters. It matters to me. It matters to her more." William considered that. Yes. It would. Vanessa's advantage had always depended on specialness. Not just beauty, but singularity. The illusion that whatever she gave a man had been tailored to him alone. Strip away that illusion and what remained was process. Method. Repetition. She would hate that far more than accusation. The door opened again, this time without a knock. Eleanor Ashford stepped into the room in a pale linen blouse and pearls, carrying the faint scent of powder and old Southern resolve. She closed the door herself behind her and looked from William to Charles to the papers spread across the desk. "I take it," she said, "this has become worse." William's older cousin had helped raise him in the years after his mother's long illness. She was not sentimental by nature, but she was loyal in the old family sense that often confused control with care. Yesterday she had tried to save the ceremony because public order had been the only language she trusted in crisis. Today, she looked less certain. "What do you need?" William asked. She came farther into the room. "I need to know whether I should be worried about the family name or about you." Charles, to his credit, said nothing. William answered honestly. "Both." Eleanor absorbed that in silence. Then she glanced at the documents and said, "I owe the child an apology. The sentence surprised him. She was right, Eleanor continued. I saw disruption and wanted it removed. I should have seen courage. Her mouth tightened. That is not a mistake I enjoy making. William looked at her carefully. There was no grand speech in it. Only the discomfort of a proud woman forced to revisit her own reflexes. In some ways, that mattered more. Annie knows who believed her first, he said. Eleanor gave him a dry look. And I suspect she knows who did not. Yes. Then I'll speak to her when the time is appropriate. Not before. William nodded once. She turned toward the window as if seeing the darkening garden for the first time. Your mother used to say, the worst people are often the ones who understand manners best. That way, everyone else does the lying for them. Charles finally allowed himself the smallest expression of approval. Wise woman. She was tired of rich people long before the rest of us earned the right. Eleanor turned back. When you decide to end this, do it cleanly, not cruelly. Men in our family have a habit of confusing the two. Then she left as quietly as she had entered. The room settled again. Rain finally began. Soft at first, then steady against the tall windows. William listened to it for a moment. The sound was calming in a way he did not entirely trust. Storms often gave the illusion of cleansing. Most of the time, they merely exposed which structures had been solid to begin with. Charles slid the Gregory Vale file into the center of the desk. One more thing. William looked up. There was a draft email, saved but never sent, from one of Vanessa's linked accounts. We recovered fragments. Not enough for court, but enough for character. What did it say? Charles checked his notes. He's almost ready. Once I'm inside, everything changes. William's face hardened. Inside, he repeated. The language is revealing, Charles said. Not married. Not committed. Inside. Inside the house. Inside the estate. Inside the protected center of a life men like William spent years defending from competitors, opportunists, and bad deals. She had not been reaching for a wedding. She had been reaching for entry. William lowered himself slowly into his chair. The rain deepened outside, blurring the gardens into shades of gray and green. Annie and Marissa would be somewhere upstairs now, likely in one of the quieter back rooms, staying out of sight because long experience had taught them that truth could still be punished long after it was spoken. Vanessa would be in the East guest suite, perhaps pacing, perhaps calculating, perhaps already planning how to recast herself when the moment finally came. William looked at the files spread across his desk and understood that the next step was no longer investigation alone. It was demolition. Not of her life. Not yet. But of the false shape she had built around herself and invited him to worship. When, he asked. Charles looked at the rain, then back at him. Tomorrow morning would be ideal. Tonight she still has uncertainty. By tomorrow we'll have enough to replace uncertainty with structure. William nodded once. Tomorrow. Then he reached for the Gregory Vale file and drew it closer. When he looked up again, there was no trace of the groom left in his face at all. Only the man Annie had interrupted in time. The rain continued through most of the night and into the early hours of the next morning, tapping steadily against the tall windows of the Ashford estate until the whole house seemed wrapped in a quiet gray restraint. By dawn the storm had passed, but its aftermath remained. The gardens glistened under a sky the color of old silver. Wet leaves clung to the flagstone paths. The air smelled of soaked earth, clipped hedges, and the faint sweetness of roses that had been removed too late. The wedding lawn, stripped now of chairs and flowers, looked almost ordinary again, except for the pale rectangular shadows in the grass where things meant for joy had stood only days before. William was already awake when the first light reached the eastern side of the house. He had dressed simply. Dark trousers. White shirt. No tie. No jacket. The formality of ceremony had long since left him. He stood alone in the upstairs hall outside the guest wing for a moment, listening to the house breathe. Somewhere below, he could hear the low, measured sounds of a household returning to itself.
Coffee being poured. Cabinet doors opening. Mrs. Porter's voice directing breakfast. A distant vacuum moving over a corridor runner.
But beneath all of it lived another awareness now, one that had nothing to do with architecture or routine.
Today he would end this.
He turned away from the East guest suite and headed downstairs toward the breakfast room, where Charles had agreed to meet him before 9. As he crossed the back hall, he caught sight of the garden through the long windows. The storm had knocked a few branches loose, and one of the groundsmen was already out there gathering them into neat piles. William watched him for a second and thought how quickly good order could be restored in visible places. It was the invisible damage that resisted being tidied. The breakfast room was quiet when he entered, but not empty. Marissa stood by the sideboard, arranging a tray with coffee, toast, and cut fruit, though she was clearly not doing it because anyone had asked. Annie sat at the far end of the table with a pencil in her hand and a piece of scrap paper in front of her, drawing in complete silence. The posture of both mother and daughter made it immediately clear that neither had slept particularly well.
Marissa looked up first. "Good morning, Mr. Ashford." "Good morning."
Annie glanced up after her mother did.
"Morning."
There was no bright politeness in the room. Only the subdued decency of people who understood that the day ahead would matter.
William crossed to the table and looked down at Annie's paper.
She had drawn the back garden, though not as it had looked during the wedding. In her version, the arch was gone. The lawn was empty. A single bird stood near the fountain.
No people at all.
"You don't draw the best parts?" he asked.
Annie's pencil paused.
"Those weren't the best parts." Marissa lowered her eyes for a second, the way people did when truth was spoken so plainly it embarrassed everyone who had tried to pretend otherwise. William took the chair opposite Annie, but remained only for a moment. "Charles and I are speaking with Vanessa this morning."
Annie nodded as if she had expected no less. Marissa, however, stiffened.
"Sir, if she says anything."
"She will say many things," William interrupted, though not unkindly. "That doesn't mean I'll believe them."
Marissa's face changed only slightly. But that slight change mattered. William saw not relief exactly, but the tension of a woman who had spent so long preparing not to be believed that trust itself now came like something fragile and unfamiliar. "You don't have to stay hidden today," he said.
"Neither of you."
Marissa gave a faint shake of her head.
"With respect, sir. Sometimes hidden is safer."
The line stopped him because it was not dramatic. It was practical. Experience made into household wisdom. Annie looked at her mother, then back at him.
"Mama means people act different when they know who caused the trouble." William considered that.
In most rooms, he would have argued the word trouble.
Here, he understood what Marissa meant. Truth did not always protect the person who spoke it. Often it marked them.
"No one in this house will blame either of you for what happened," he said.
Marissa's voice remained low. Not out loud.
The sentence settled in him with the quiet force of accuracy. He did not answer immediately because he could not honestly deny it.
Not entirely.
Even in a household as carefully run as his, invisible lines existed.
Loyalty. Class. Habit. Discomfort.
People would say what they were told to say. But inside themselves, some would still blame the disruption before they blamed the lie that had required it. Annie resumed drawing, speaking without looking up.
"You can't stop people from thinking wrong." William almost smiled. "No. Apparently I can't."
She nodded as though pleased he had finally admitted something obvious. A soft knock sounded at the doorway. Charles stepped in carrying a leather folio and wearing the expression of a man who had slept exactly enough to remain efficient and not 1 minute more. "We're ready," he said.
William stood.
Marissa turned toward him instinctively.
"Mr. Ashford."
He paused. "If she tries to make this about us," Marissa said, "don't let her." The request was simple. The history behind it was not. William understood that for women like Marissa, being dragged into the center of someone else's wrongdoing often led to a second injustice. Being made responsible for the mess created by people with more beauty, more money, more ease, more public sympathy.
"I won't," he said. Then he looked at Annie.
She had stopped drawing again and was watching him with the same clear, unwavering attention she had carried into the wedding garden.
"What?" he asked.
"Don't let her make you feel sorry for her first," Annie said. Charles, standing near the doorway, said nothing. But William saw the brief flicker in his face that meant he understood the precision of the warning. "I don't intend to," William replied.
Annie nodded once, apparently satisfied.
He and Charles left the breakfast room together and moved down the back corridor toward the formal side of the house. Morning light stretched long across the floorboards, catching on framed landscapes and silver bowls arranged in niches built for display. As they walked, the house seemed to divide itself once again into its familiar halves.
Front rooms for appearances. Back rooms for reality.
William had known that division all his life. Only now was he beginning to understand how moral it could become. "She's been asking for a phone again," Charles said quietly as they reached the main hall. "Also for access to her luggage without staff present."
"And I declined both." William nodded.
At the far end of the hall, the library doors stood closed. That room had changed in his mind over the last 48 hours. It was no longer simply a room for contracts, family documents, and private conversations. It had become the place where illusion ended. He could almost feel the previous evening still lingering behind those doors.
Vanessa's insistence. Her wounded dignity.
The first signs that she was not afraid of losing him, but of losing entry. Charles stopped beside him before they went in. "One thing," he said.
William waited.
"She is likely to use whatever still works.
Sentiment, offense, humiliation, intimacy, class discomfort, moral reversal. She may accuse you of cruelty because she cannot survive on innocence any longer."
He held William's gaze.
"Do not answer her as a man who was almost married. Answer her as a man reviewing a pattern."
William absorbed that, then gave a single nod. From somewhere above them came the faint sound of a door closing.
Perhaps in the East Guest Suite. Perhaps elsewhere. It did not matter. The house itself seemed to know what hour this was. William placed his hand on the library door and opened it. Vanessa was already inside.
She stood at the far side of the room near the tall windows, dressed not in bridal white or evening silk now, but in a soft cream blouse and tailored slacks.
Understated enough to suggest innocence. Composed enough to imply restraint.
She had done her hair simply.
No dramatic cosmetics. No jewels except small earrings.
She had dressed not like a fiancée, nor like a woman under suspicion, but like the reasonable party in a difficult conversation.
William noticed all of it immediately.
So did Charles.
Vanessa turned as they entered, and for one carefully controlled second, the room held all three of them in silence.
Then she looked directly at William and said in a voice calm enough to be dangerous, "I hope for all our sakes that you're finally prepared to be fair."
William stepped fully into the room and closed the door behind him. "No," he said. "I'm prepared to be accurate." Vanessa did not answer at once.
She remained where she was by the window, one hand resting lightly against the back of a chair as rain-washed light spilled in behind her and softened the outline of her face. The careful simplicity of her clothes had not been chosen by accident. She had stripped away glamour and ceremony and put on reason instead. She looked less like a woman caught in a lie than a woman prepared to endure a misunderstanding with composure.
William noticed the calculation immediately.
And the fact that he noticed it so quickly told him how much had changed. Charles moved to the sideboard without asking permission and set his folio down there, creating distance rather than sharing the desk with either of them.
It was a small choice, but an intelligent one.
This was no longer a conversation between lovers.
It was an assessment. Vanessa's eyes flicked once toward Charles and then back to William. "Accurate," she repeated. "All right, then let's be accurate. A child interrupted our wedding.
A member of your household brought old pain into a room where it did not belong.
I reacted badly because anyone would have. That is what happened. William did not sit. No. That is what you would prefer happened.
Her expression cooled slightly.
And what would you prefer? The truth.
Vanessa gave a slow, controlled breath as though summoning patience for a man determined to make himself difficult.
William, I knew Daniel Brooks years ago. I told you that already. It was brief. It was messy. He misrepresented his life to me, as men often do.
If I had known everything, I would never have been involved. Charles said quietly, that explanation might have carried more weight if you had offered it before being confronted with evidence.
Vanessa did not look at him. I was publicly accused at my own wedding by a child whose mother has every reason to hate me. William's voice remained even. Marissa has reasons. That doesn't make her wrong. Vanessa's gaze sharpened. You're doing it again. Doing what? Turning grievance into credibility.
She took one careful step away from the window. That woman has had years to build a story around a failed marriage. Years to explain to herself why her husband left.
People do that, William. They simplify. They choose a villain. It helps them survive. William said nothing.
The line was skillful.
He had to give her that. It turned betrayal into perspective, pain into storytelling, evidence into coping. In another week, another room, with less preparation, it might even have worked. Charles opened his folio and drew out the first document. Then let's simplify less.
Vanessa's eyes moved to the paper, and William saw something subtle pass through her posture.
Not alarm yet. Calculation adjusting itself.
Charles laid the document on the desk.
Robert Leland. Macon. Commercial property owner. Widower.
Miss Hale appears with him publicly within 7 months of his wife's death. He covered your lease for 14 months and funded 2 trips. You disappeared from his life shortly after the sale of his land.
Vanessa's expression did not change. And? Charles repeated mildly, and? You'd like me to define the word pattern before we proceed?
He was lonely, Vanessa said.
We spent time together. That is not a crime.
No, William said.
It isn't. Charles placed a second document beside the first. Stephen Mercer. Retired dentist. Savannah. Widower. Multiple will revisions during your involvement. Shared address activity. Financial support.
Then distance after his daughters intervened.
Vanessa folded her arms. Older men date younger women all the time.
Last I checked, that had not yet become illegal either.
William watched her carefully.
There was not a trace of shame in her.
Only irritation at being forced to look at repetition in daylight.
Charles drew out the Daniel Brooks file last and placed it at the front of the desk, distinct from the others.
And then Daniel. Married. Working class. Financially strained. Progressive transfers. Hospital gaps. Support withdrawal. Death in reduced circumstances. For the first time, Vanessa's face changed. Not with remorse. With contempt. Too brief to be theatrical.
That one was different, she said. William's eyes narrowed.
How? She realized too late that she had answered too fast. I mean only that it was less serious.
He was never in a position to offer me the kind of life you seem determined to imagine. The room went very still. Charles did not speak.
He did not need to. William took one step forward. So Annie was right. Vanessa straightened. About what? About money. She let out a breath through her nose. Money matters to everyone, William. Don't insult us both by pretending otherwise. It mattered to Daniel because he didn't have enough. It matters to your staff because they can't afford not to think about it.
It matters to your family because they built their whole identity around protecting it. And yes, it matters to women who are tired of struggling. Her eyes held his. The only difference is that some of us are honest about it. It was a dangerous speech because parts of it were true. That was what made it poisonous. William thought of Marissa in the service kitchen, slicing peaches with exhausted hands. Of Annie saving half a strip of bacon for later. Of the invisible labor that kept his estate running. Money did matter. But there were different ways of answering its demands. Marissa had worked. Vanessa had extracted. You're confusing survival with appetite, he said. No, Vanessa replied sharply. You are confusing appetite with sin because you were raised in rooms where wanting things could be disguised as taste. Charles glanced at William, perhaps to see whether the line struck home. It did. Though not in the way she intended. William moved behind the desk and opened the top file himself. He took out the printed reservation record and the florist invoice. Gregory Vale. Vanessa went still. There it is, Charles said softly. She turned to him. I don't know what you think you have. William held up the documents. A dinner reservation 6 weeks ago. White orchids delivered to a private address. Burner phone traffic. Secondary email. All while you were helping plan this house for a wedding. Vanessa's control finally thinned. I had dinner with someone. That proves nothing. It proves overlap, Charles said. Which is enough to destroy any argument that your relationship with William was singular or sincere. She laughed once, though there was no humor in it. Sincere? Is that really the standard now? Are we discussing sincerity as if men like him ever marry for pure reasons? William looked at her with such steadiness that she stopped. You tell me, he said. Why did you agree to marry me? Her silence lasted longer this time. Not because she was ashamed. Because she was choosing between strategies and understood that innocence was no longer available. At last, she said, because you offered stability. Charles made a note. William did not blink. Stability? Yes. Not love. Vanessa's chin lifted. Love is a luxury people talk about when the bills are already paid. The answer carried the whole shape of her life inside it. Not romance. Not devotion. Not even delusion. Transaction elevated to philosophy. William thought he might feel more devastated hearing it plainly. Instead, what he felt was a narrowing, a clarification so cold it almost resembled peace. And after marriage, he asked. What then? Vanessa gave a slight shrug. Then I would have become your wife. That is not an answer. It is the only answer that matters. No, William said. It isn't. Annie said you use men for their money and leave them when the giving stops. Was she wrong? Vanessa's mouth tightened. Children repeat what makes them feel safe. Answer the question. She's a child. Answer it. For the first time, something like anger flashed openly across her face. Fine. Sometimes men become disappointing. Sometimes they become sick, boring, weak, possessive, frightened, or pathetic. Sometimes they ask for more loyalty than they ever earned. And sometimes leaving them is the smartest thing a woman can do. The silence that followed was absolute. It was all there now. Daniel Brooks. Robert Leland. Stephen Mercer. Gregory Vale, waiting in the wings. Every man reduced not to a life but to utility. Every promise measured against comfort. Every attachment kept only as long as it remained profitable, flattering, or easy. Charles closed his folio. There was no need for further sequencing. She had completed the structure herself. William spoke with great care. You left Daniel when he got sick. Vanessa rolled one shoulder. The nearest she had come yet to open dismissal. He was already falling apart. And you took his money before that.
He gave it. You kept Gregory Vale alive while planning a wedding here. She said nothing.
You were prepared to marry me for access, not commitment.
Still nothing.
At last, she looked at him directly and said, "You make it sound uglier than it is." William stared at her.
"No," he said. "I make it sound accurate." She let out a brittle breath. "And what now? You send me away with a speech about character? You pretend this house is morally cleaner than the world I came from? You congratulate yourself for listening to the servant's child in time?" The cruelty of the phrase landed, but not where she wanted it to. William thought of Annie on the terrace. Of Marissa's exhausted dignity.
Of Eleanor admitting she had seen disruption when she should have seen courage.
Vanessa still believed status determined truth. Even now.
"What happens now," he said, "is that this ends."
Her face hardened. "You think you can simply erase me?"
"No," Charles said before William could answer.
"But we can remove you."
Vanessa looked from one man to the other, and for the first time since the wedding interruption, her composure gave way. Not to tears or pleading,
but to naked fury.
"All of this," she said, "because one girl opened her mouth at the wrong time." William's voice dropped lower.
"No.
All of this because she opened it at the right one." Vanessa held his gaze a moment longer, breathing hard but controlled. Then the anger settled into something colder. "You will regret this," she said.
William thought of the ring box in his drawer. The wedding lawn after rain. The names in Charles's files.
And the half-slice of bacon Annie had saved because children who had seen things vanish did not assume abundance would always wait for them.
"No," he said quietly. Regret was waiting at the altar. This is what came after. Vanessa did not leave the library gracefully.
For a few strange seconds after William's last words, she simply stood there, shoulders squared and face set in a stillness too deliberate to be natural. The room had changed around her. It was not merely that she had lost the argument. It was that the old tools no longer worked.
Injury had failed. Reason had failed. Charm had failed.
Even anger, which so often startled weak men into retreat, had found no place to land. Charles closed the last folder with quiet precision and moved it to one side of the desk. The sound seemed final in a way raised voices never were.
Vanessa's gaze shifted between the two men.
"So that's it," she said.
"You sit in judgment. Decide what kind of woman I am and throw me out of the life you begged me to join." William looked at her steadily. "I invited you into my life. I did not invite you to study how to enter it. That is a matter of opinion."
"No," he said.
"It's a matter of pattern."
Something in her mouth tightened at that word.
Pattern.
It was the one thing she could not afford to be.
A pattern was not romantic.
It was not singular. It was not tragic.
It was procedural. Repeated. Strip away uniqueness and what remained was method.
William could see from the flicker in her eyes that she understood exactly how much that diminished the version of herself she had relied on men to worship. Charles spoke in the same even tone he might have used to explain a contract amendment.
"Miss Hale, practical arrangements will be made within the hour. You may collect your personal belongings under supervision. A car will take you wherever you request within city limits. After that, any further contact with Mr. Ashford will go through my office."
Vanessa turned toward him slowly.
"Under supervision?" "Yes. You're treating me like a thief."
Charles did not blink.
"I'm treating you like a legal risk." The insult landed cleanly. Not because it was cruel, but because it was administrative. Vanessa had likely spent years avoiding precisely this sort of categorization.
Women like her survived by remaining emotionally vivid, morally ambiguous, impossible to reduce. Charles had just made her a file. She turned back to William.
"Are you really going to hide behind your lawyer now?" "I'm not hiding," William said. "I'm ensuring clarity." "Clarity?"
Her laugh this time was brittle and short. What a cold little word. Is that what you tell yourself so you don't have to admit you almost married someone you never understood? That one was aimed to wound. It would have wounded him 48 hours earlier. Now it only sharpened his sense of how often she mistook exposure for intimacy. You're right about one thing, he said. I didn't understand you. Vanessa's eyes flashed, perhaps thinking for 1 second that she had reopened something useful. Then he continued. I thought you valued steadiness. I thought you respected restraint. I thought you recognized loneliness because you had suffered some version of it yourself. What you recognized was access. What you valued was entry. And what you called love was proximity to security. The words did not come loudly. They came with the quiet force of something already decided. Vanessa's posture stiffened further. You want to make me into a villain because it flatters your pride. William almost answered, then didn't. There was no point. She would continue to rename consequences as vanity for as long as she needed to survive it. Instead, he said, this conversation is over. For the first time since Annie had interrupted the wedding, a trace of something like panic showed itself in Vanessa. Not fear of danger, but fear of finality. It passed quickly, dressed at once in indignation. You don't get to dismiss me like staff, she snapped. The sentence hung in the room like a stain. Charles's expression did not change. But William felt something harden in him at the word. Not because it offended class etiquette. Because it revealed again exactly how Vanessa sorted human value when pressure stripped away polish. No, William said quietly. Staff are the people who kept this house functioning while you were trying to get inside it. Vanessa opened her mouth. But before she could answer, something shifted in the doorway. All three of them turned. Annie stood there at the edge of the library threshold. She had not entered the room fully. One hand rested on the frame. The other hung at her side. She must have come down the hall without anyone noticing. Light-footed in the way children often were when adults assumed they were elsewhere. Behind her, just a few steps back, Marissa had stopped dead. One hand pressed to her chest as though she had arrived 1 second too late to keep her daughter from hearing whatever came next. For a moment, no one moved. Vanessa's face changed first. It did not go soft. It did not go careful. If anything, being seen by Annie at this exact moment stripped away the last performance she might have been tempted to offer. Well, she said, looking directly at the child. There she is. The little hero. Marissa stepped forward at once. Annie, come away from the door. But Annie did not move. Her face was calm. Not defiant. Not triumphant. Only attentive, as if she had learned long ago that the most important truths often came in the seconds adults forgot to manage themselves. Vanessa let out one cool breath and looked Annie up and down with open irritation. You've caused enough. William's voice dropped. That's enough. Vanessa ignored him. Do you feel proud of yourself? She asked Annie. Interrupting a wedding. Turning a house upside down. Making your mother's life more difficult in a place where she ought to know better than to bring old bitterness. Marissa flinched as if struck. But Annie answered before her mother could speak. I told the truth. Vanessa's mouth curved. But there was no warmth in it. Children always think that. You hear one side of a story, repeat it loudly enough, and then wait for grown people to reward you. William took one step toward the doorway. But Annie stayed where she was. You left my daddy, Annie said. The room went still again. Vanessa's eyes narrowed. Your father left himself. Marissa made a small, broken sound. Please don't. But Vanessa was already looking at Annie with the cruel clarity of someone who no longer cared whether the room admired her. Men like your father ruin their own lives, she said. Weak men always need someone else to blame when they disappoint everybody. William saw the words hit Annie. Not as shock, but as confirmation. The child did not shrink. She did not cry.
She simply watched Vanessa more steadily than before, as though some last uncertainty had now been removed forever. Marissa stepped fully in then, reaching for Annie's shoulder. "We're leaving." But Vanessa was not finished. "And your mother," she said, her tone sharpening further, "would rather spend years polishing silver in someone else's house than admit she was never enough to keep a man's attention." The line cracked through the library like something ugly and thrown. William did not remember crossing the room. 1 second he was by the desk. The next he was standing between Vanessa and the doorway. Close enough that she finally had to look up at him instead of past him. "You are done speaking to them," he said. His voice was very low. Vanessa's chin lifted, but for the first time, it did not lift with confidence. It lifted with reflex. "I only said what everyone knows." "No," William said. "You said what you are." Charles had already moved to the side of the room where the internal phone sat on a console table. He lifted the receiver without taking his eyes off Vanessa and instructed security to report to the library immediately. Annie, still at the door, looked not frightened, but older somehow, as if every adult weakness in the room had just declared itself openly, and she had no further use for pretending otherwise. William turned slightly toward Marissa without taking his attention off Vanessa. "Take Annie upstairs." Marissa nodded at once. But Annie spoke before she could be guided away. "You said the same kinds of things about my daddy, didn't you?" she asked Vanessa. "Before he got sick." Vanessa gave a short, cold laugh. "Your father did not need much help becoming pathetic." That was the moment whatever remained of ambiguity died. Not because the insult was dramatic. Because it was effortless. William thought of Daniel Brooks as he existed only in fragments now. Smiling in one worn photograph. Thinner in another. A man who had become foolish and then abandoned. Yes. But still a human being. He thought of Marissa keeping receipts because she knew the world would not believe a woman like her without paper. He thought of Annie on the terrace, saving half a piece of bacon because children who had seen things disappear did not assume abundance would stay. And he understood with perfect final certainty that Vanessa had not simply used men. She had despised weakness while feeding on it. The library door opened again. 2 household security men stepped in, both discreetly dressed, both alert enough to understand from the room alone that this was no longer a family disagreement. Charles replaced the phone receiver and said, "Miss Hale is leaving now." Vanessa looked from the guards to William. "You'd throw me out in front of them?" William met her gaze without softness. "You were prepared to become my wife in front of everyone. You can leave in front of witnesses, too." Her face hardened into something almost unrecognizable from the woman who had once stood under white roses and smiled at him as though she were the gentlest thing in the world. "This house deserves exactly what it gets after this," she said. "No," William replied. "What it deserves is peace." He stepped back just enough for the guards to approach. Vanessa did not struggle. She would never give a room that satisfaction. Instead, she gathered what remained of her dignity around herself like a coat and walked toward the door under escort. But as she passed Annie, she made the mistake of looking directly at her one last time. Annie did not look away. And that, more than the guards or the lawyer or the broken engagement, seemed to humiliate her most. The front door closed several minutes later with a heavy, unmistakable finality. For a moment after the sound traveled through the house, no one in the library spoke. Then Annie looked up at William and said, in the same calm voice she had used when she first ran into the garden, "Now she's really gone." William looked at the child who had seen the truth before any of them had wanted to, and answered with equal plainness. "Yes," he said. "Now she is." After Vanessa Hale left the Ashford estate, the house did not erupt into relief. It settled. The kind of settling that came after a storm, when the windows were still damp, the air still changed, and every room seemed to be listening for the sound that had finally stopped. The front hall, with its polished floors and high arrangement of white lilies, no longer felt like a place preparing to receive important guests. It felt like a house that had been holding its breath and was now learning how to exhale again. William remained in the library for a few minutes after the front door shut behind Vanessa.
Charles stayed only long enough to confirm that the car had left the property and that the gate staff had been instructed not to admit her again under any circumstance. Then he gathered the folders, left one slim stack on the desk for William, and quietly excused himself to begin the necessary legal housekeeping that always followed the emotional kind. In Charles's world, endings became paperwork first and reflection second. That left William standing alone for the first time all morning in the room where the truth had finally been forced into the open. He looked at the desk, at the remaining documents, at the rain-dimmed garden beyond the windows, and then at the empty space where Vanessa had stood. It was strange, he thought, how quickly a person's absence could reveal what their presence had really been. The room did not feel lonelier without her in it. It felt clearer. A soft knock interrupted the silence. It was Eleanor. She stepped in without ceremony. A woman of a certain age and manner who had long since learned that the most serious moments in a family did not improve with dramatics. She wore navy that day, simple pearls, and the expression of someone prepared to speak honestly at some cost to her own pride. "Is it done?" she asked. "Yes." Eleanor nodded once and closed the door behind her. She looked around the library, taking in the papers, the dim light, the stillness that followed violent clarity. "I suppose that's the only mercy in a thing like this," she said. "When it's finally exposed, at least it stops pretending." William leaned one hand against the desk. "You always did know how to make comfort sound like correction. I learned from your mother." That shifted something in him. Quiet and familiar. Eleanor came farther into the room. "I spoke to Mrs. Porter. She says Marissa is upstairs with Annie." William nodded. "She also says the child has more composure than half the adults who were in that garden." "That's true." Eleanor studied him for a long second. "You should go to them." He understood at once what she meant. Not as employer. Not as owner of the house. As the man whose life had been changed by what that child had dared to say. "I know," he said. Eleanor glanced toward the window, where the garden beyond still carried faint traces of wedding color in the deep green shrubs and pale stone paths. "I tried to save the ceremony," she said. "I told myself I was saving dignity. That is the sort of lie older people become dangerously skilled at telling ourselves." William said nothing. She looked at him directly. "I was wrong." The admission mattered because it had cost her something. "I know," he said again. But more gently. Eleanor gave a small nod and moved toward the door. "Then don't repeat my mistake. If a child has the courage to speak the truth in a room built to silence her, the least the adults can do is answer honestly." She paused with her hand on the knob. "And William." "Yes. Do not turn gratitude into charity. Marissa has had enough of that from the world." Then she left. William stayed where he was only another moment before crossing the hall and heading toward the back staircase. Not the main staircase with its framed portraits and polished banister, but the quieter one used daily by the household, the one that connected the running parts of the house to one another without spectacle. He might not have noticed the choice once. Now he did. He found Marissa and Annie in the upstairs sitting room at the rear of the house. The one with the quilted sofa, the old lamp with the stained glass shade, and the view of the side lawn where the magnolia tree leaned slightly east after years of storm wind. It was not one of the grand rooms. It was one of the rooms people actually recovered in. Marissa stood when he entered, but only halfway. As though she was too tired for full formality. Annie sat on the carpet by the coffee table with a box of crayons and the same scrap paper she had been drawing on that morning. Biscuit, a dog from one of the neighboring properties who often wandered near the service drive and whom Annie had somehow persuaded the groundsmen to tolerate during the past 2 days, lay asleep near the window with his paws twitching in a dream. William noticed at once that Annie had drawn the garden again. This time there were people in it. Not many. Just 3 figures near the fountain. One small, one medium, one tall. "Is she gone?" Annie asked before he could speak. "Yes." "Gone for real?" "Yes."
Annie nodded once and went back to coloring the magnolia leaves green. Marissa looked at William with the kind of caution that did not come from distrust anymore, but from long practice with disappointment. "Thank you," she said, and the words were quieter than gratitude usually sounded. "For believing her. For not letting that woman turn this around on us." William looked at Annie, then back at Marissa. "I should have listened sooner." Marissa's face softened, though only slightly. "Maybe. But you listened before it was too late." The sentence stayed with him. It was truer than absolution and kinder than accusation. He moved farther into the room and sat in the armchair opposite them. For a while, no one spoke. The house around them was quieter than it had been in days. Somewhere below, lunch dishes were being cleared. From outside came the slow, wet drip of rain still falling from tree branches onto stone. The ordinary sounds of a life continuing. At last, William said, "You won't be leaving." Marissa blinked. "Sir. I know you were considering it." He looked directly at her. "You and Annie are not leaving this house because someone else brought corruption into it." Marissa lowered her eyes for a second. "I don't want people thinking I stayed to gain something." "People will think whatever saves them from examining themselves," William said. "That is no longer my concern." Annie glanced up from the carpet. "That sounds like something Mama would say." For the first time in days, a real smile almost touched Marissa's mouth. William continued. "Your position here stays exactly as secure as it was before. More secure, actually. Charles is drawing up an adjustment to your salary and benefits. Annie's schooling will be covered. If you ever want to move into the cottage on the north side of the property instead of commuting, that will be made available, too." Marissa's expression changed at once. Not with joy, but with resistance. "Mr. Ashford," she said quietly. "I don't want pity." He shook his head. "Good. Because that is not what this is." She held his gaze. "This is me correcting what I can," he said. "Not the past. I can't do anything about that. But I can do something about what happens next." Marissa looked at her hands for a long moment. When she looked up again, her eyes were bright, though she did not cry. "Then thank you," she said. "For saying it that way." Annie put down a green crayon and asked, "What about the wedding stuff?" William followed her gaze to the window, where one corner of the garden could be seen through wet glass. "It's gone." "All of it?" "All of it." She considered that, and then asked the question only Annie would have asked. "Are you sad?" William answered honestly. "I'm disappointed in myself. But I'm not sad she's gone." Annie accepted that without surprise. "That means you knew she was wrong before you wanted to." He gave a quiet breath that might have become a laugh. "That sounds uncomfortably accurate." "I told you," she said. "Yes," he replied. "You did." She returned to her drawing, satisfied. Marissa watched him for another moment and said, she was right about one thing. People do hear better when someone looks nice. But sometimes they remember better when the truth comes from a voice they can't ignore. William looked at Annie. At the bent head over the crayons. At the serious concentration. At the child who had crossed a lawn full of status and flowers and polished adulthood to stop a lie from becoming permanent. "Yes," he said. "And sometimes the bravest person in the room is the one everyone else expected to stay quiet." Later that afternoon, Charles left for the city and Eleanor retired to make a series of careful calls meant to manage family gossip before it spread beyond repair. William walked alone out into the garden. The ground was still damp beneath his shoes. The rose arch was gone. The white chairs were gone. The candles, the ribbons, the aisle runner, the silver stands. All of it had been taken away. Only the shape of the place remained. The broad lawn. The old oaks. The stone path. The fountain at the center. Without the wedding decorations, the garden looked less impressive and more honest. He stopped where the altar had stood.
From here, he could picture the whole thing too clearly.
Vanessa in ivory. The minister waiting. The ring in his hand. Annie's voice cutting through the violins. The way every adult had turned first, not toward truth, but toward disruption.
It shamed him still, that instinct in himself.
The reflex to restore order before asking what order had been protecting.
He looked toward the back of the house where the upstairs sitting room windows caught the late afternoon light.
He could not see Annie from here.
But he could imagine her there on the carpet, coloring the garden as it ought to have been all along. A breeze moved through the wet leaves above him. William stood there for a long time before speaking aloud, though no one was near enough to hear him.
"Everyone in that garden saw a little girl causing trouble," he said.
Then he looked down at the damp grass where the vows had almost been spoken, and finished the thought.
Not as a performance, but as a verdict. She was the only one brave enough to tell the truth. The words did not undo anything.
They did not restore Daniel Brooks, erase Marissa's years of humiliation, or return the part of William that had almost mistaken polished hunger for love. But they placed the truth where it belonged.
In the open air. Without apology. Without decoration. Without asking permission from anyone richer or older or more comfortable.
By the time he went back inside, the house felt different.
Not healed. Healing would take longer.
Trust, even in its most practical forms, never returned on command.
But the estate no longer felt occupied by a lie. It felt inhabited again. By work. By memory. By ordinary kindness.
By people who had been there all along and were finally being seen in full. And that, William understood as he closed the garden doors behind him, was not a grand ending.
It was something better. It was a true one.
This story reminds us that truth does not always come from the richest, loudest, or most respected person in the room.
Sometimes it comes from the one people are quickest to ignore.
It teaches that appearances can be polished, charm can be practiced, and kindness can be imitated.
But character always reveals itself in the end.
It honors the courage of children and the dignity of those who are often overlooked, showing that real justice begins the moment someone chooses to listen. Above all, it tells us that silent loyalty is more valuable than beautiful deception, and that a single brave voice can stop a lifetime of regret.
Thank you for watching Storyverse.
If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe so more stories like this can find the people who need them most.